Donc, merci à toutes et tous d'être là encore. I'm going to continue in English so that our panelists understand. So, when we were thinking of this conference, Karine Gentelet and I, we were in charge of the last day, and we had this idea, maybe because we are trained as sociologists, to bring different perspectives at the table. We wanted people from different disciplines and also people who are closer to the ground on the field, trying to apply all those rules and norms in AI or put them forward, trying to interpret them. So we wanted to bring those perspectives, maybe to see the blind spots in all this. You know, there's a big development of AI ethics charters, norms, so we could, you know, sit back and relax, feel satisfied with all we've accomplished because we've done more than with any other previous technology. But we felt that it was still necessary to show the blind spots, talk about what's not maybe talked about, what's not visible. So we've invited people from different fields. So this morning, we're going to have people from sociology, from economy, from history, communication backgrounds, to talk to us about what are the challenges, the difficulties, the risks with what is developing right now in AI around it. So the ethics and the norms that are developing around in order to put a frame, regulate how AI is developing and going into the world. We're going to have shorter presentations. After that, I'm going to take one or two very short questions, clarification questions, questions that are directly in line with the presentations. Please keep the existential questions, philosophical questions, and comments for the end, because you will have the chance to address that in the second part with the discussion. So we wanted shorter presentations, just quick questions, and then we're going to come back after the break with a discussion to be all on the same level, answering the same questions. So I'm going to have questions for our panelists, and then I'm going to also take questions from the public again. So it should be a very interesting discussion. So have a good panel, and I'm going to start introducing the first panelist, which is Pieter Verdegem. He's a reader in technology and society at the Westminster School of Media and Communication and member of the Communication and Media Research Institute, CAMRI, at the University of Westminster. His research investigates the political economy of media and communication and the impact of digital technologies on society. He's a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and he is the course leader of the interdisciplinary MA in Data, Culture, and Society. He holds a PhD in Communication Sciences from Ghent University in Belgium. And also, I will add, he's the editor of the book AI for Everyone, Critical Perspectives, who is available in open access, if I'm not mistaken. So he will give you the link at the end. Pieter, I invite you to come here, and he will talk to us about the contribution of political economy to critical AI perspective.
Before I start my talk, I would like to say that I'm on strike today. Over 70,000 staff at 150 universities in the UK are on strike in disputes over pay, working conditions, casualization, and equality. So I want to use the opportunity to say solidarity to everyone on the picket line fighting for the future of higher education in the UK. And frankly, also solidarity to the people who are standing outside of the library here. I'm not sure if they're still here today, but I saw them yesterday. So let's get started with the talk. Technological innovation, as you know, has always been surrounded by hype, and this is not different for artificial intelligence. In the talk, I want to argue that critical AI perspectives are needed to scrutinize which forces are driving the AI hype. Because when analyzing AI, we need to untangle what exactly is at stake and who is behind the myths and discourses that are created around that hype. And in the talk, I argue that political economy or critical political economy is an important framework that allows us to critically investigate AI, particularly looking at AI ownership structures and also AI ideology. So before we can turn to the analysis of economic and symbolic power in the context of AI, we need to agree on what type of AI we are talking about. And this might sound strange because we're talking here in a conference about AI. But it's worth mentioning this because the only thing everyone in the field of AI agrees about is that there's no generally accepted definition of artificial intelligence. I use here Russell and Norvig, who argue that for a computer or a machine to be intelligent, it needs to possess the following capabilities. First of all, natural language processing, being able to communicate successfully. Second, knowledge representation, being able to store what it knows or hears. Third, automated reasoning, being able to use the stored information to answer questions and draw new conclusions. And then last, machine learning, being able to adapt to new circumstances and to detect and extrapolate patterns. So it is important to understand that machine learning AI is the currently dominant AI paradigm and allows to solve problems in ways that earlier AI paradigms, such as, for example, expert systems, were not capable of. And it's breakthroughs in machine learning techniques which support the development of more sophisticated machine learning and deep learning models, together with the growing availability of data with which algorithms can be trained, as well as the increasing availability of powerful computing capacity that is behind the current wave and period of AI hype. However, these technical approaches of AI are only one part of the story of conceptualizing AI. So in addition to this, we also need to perceive AI as industrial infrastructures as well as social practices. So first, it's important to look at the industrial infrastructures that are needed to produce and deploy AI. The infrastructure entails the possibility to collect vast amounts of data, but also the computing power to perform machine learning and deep learning models. And second, AI also refers to social practices, because algorithms, machine learning, and deep learning models, in the end, they are classification systems that are developed by humans. And these classification systems are social and political, as it is up to individuals and groups to decide how these classification systems look like, which classification systems are being used, and for what purposes. So then finally, what are critical AI perspectives or critical AI studies? So any critical analysis of technological innovation should always start with questioning who is behind the technology, to whom it is offered, and who benefits from it. So critical analysis of AI should investigate what is AI, what visions exist around it, who is behind the surrounding ideologies and discourses, and who can decide about what type of AI is being produced and how it is used. So very quickly here, why, or a bit more information about political economy and why it's a suitable framework for having a critical approach on AI. So it is a subfield within political economy that has emerged from the critique of political economy. And critical political economy is particularly interested in how economic factors influence politics and social relationships. So central in its analysis is power. So critical political economy studies who has the power to make decisions about media and communication systems and who benefits from this. Critical political economy analyzes the unequal distribution of power and looks at the contexts and practices in which, as a result, inequalities are being produced and sustained. So central in its analysis are the structures and consequences of ownership regimes and how these are maintained by interactions between governments and industry. So critical political economy focuses its analysis on how ideology is used to legitimize power inequalities within the capitalist system. And of course, power is a contested concept in social theory. A pragmatic definition of power could be the capacity of actors to accomplish things in the world. The famous sociologist John Thompson, he provided a useful typology of power in which he distinguishes between economic, political, coercive, and symbolic power. So economic power has its origins in human productive activity and refers to how certain individuals and groups in society can accumulate resources for that productive activity. Political power then stems from the activity of coordinating individuals and regulating the pattern of their behavior. Coercive power can involve the threatened use of force to subdue or to conquer an opponent, but is mainly is about preventing people or groups to act in a certain way. And then, important for this talk here, symbolic power stems from the activity of producing, transmitting, and receiving meaningful symbolic forms, so a process of meaning making, and thereby involves the influencing of the actions of others. So in the context of AI, power decides about who can and will benefit from these new technologies and applications. But also we have to be aware that a concentration of power results in growing inequalities and other negative outcomes. So let's talk about economic power concentration. The AI industry is dominated by a small number of extremely powerful companies from either the US and China. In the US, we have GAFAM, Google, Alphabet, Apple, Facebook, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft. And in China, BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. Especially since 2015, these companies have become more aggressive in their competition for AI dominance by acquiring startups as well as heavily investing in compute capacity, which led to a concentrated AI industrial landscape. A standard definition of media concentration is basically an increase in the presence of one or a handful of media companies in any market as a result of various possible processes such as acquisitions, mergers, deals with other companies, or even the disappearance of competitors. And they can do this by vertical, horizontal integration, conglomeration, or strategic alliances. The phenomenon of concentration points at some of the contradictions of the capitalist reproduction, because although competition is considered one of the central pillars of capitalism, it's in the interest of each company or each capitalist to suppress competition. And as a result, the communication sector, but also the AI sector, is characterized by a tendency to monopoly. So how does this work in the context of AI? The AI industry is dominated by platforms who all have ready access to large amounts of data. And platforms follow specific strategies and adjust their architecture to attract new and diverse user groups, as well as facilitate engagement on their platform. But data is not only important to determining the value of a platform, it's also crucial for developing and improving AI systems. And this allows to develop better performing machine learning and deep learning models, which in turn results in better services, which then allows to attract more users. So it's like a data feedback cycle. So AI or platform capitalism is characterized by the winner takes all principle, meaning that these markets have a tendency for monopolization. And this plays out on two levels. So first of all, AI compute capacity, which entails the hard and software, which is engineered to facilitate and support the development of AI applications. So this includes large data centers, supercomputers, and cloud providers. So AI compute capacity is essential in controlling the AI markets. And both US and Chinese big tech companies have made major investments in compute capacity, such as cloud computing. Second, there is increased competition over hiring human AI talent. So those are the computer scientists who are behind the further development of and breakthroughs in machine learning and deep learning. Highly specialized IT talent is very expensive, and it requires people having accumulated large experience, either through formal training, for example, PhDs, or years of applied work. And big tech companies engage in acquiring AI startups, not only for purchasing a new potentially profitable AI niche, but also and especially for being able to hire the brightest AI talent. So the consequences of concentration, whether it's the media sector or the AI sector, are pretty similar. So it results in economic centralization, which means control over price, quality, and technological standards, but also, and more importantly, political, economic, and ideologic power. Specifically in the case of AI, with such a large and global dominance in the hands of 8-10 big AI companies, it gives these corporate powers the ability to decide how the future of AI looks like and who is able to benefit from this. And this brings us to a discussion about AI ideology and symbolic power. So again, following Thompson's framework, symbolic power focuses on producing, transmitting, and receiving meaningful symbolic forms, which are basically individuals expressing themselves about social life. So when doing so, they rely on what Thompson calls the means of information and communication, which refers to the resources, the skills, and the knowledge necessary to engage in exchanging symbolic forms. Ideology is just as power a contested concept in social theory. It can be seen in a more neutral perspective as the ideas and worldviews that exist in society. However, a more critical interpretation of ideology means that it's being used for a specific purpose, which basically is about serving the material interests of ruling classes or dominant groups in society. And ideology also plays an important role in promoting the myths and discourses about AI, portraying a vision of a specific type of society and the role digital technology plays in it. Berman wrote already in the 1990s, several decades before the current AI hype, how AI as a technological paradigm is a major component of an hegemonic ideology being used to maintain essential structures of capitalism and preventing viable alternatives to be envisioned. So in this context, it's important to investigate what visions about AI are being promoted and who is behind them. And one of the occasions where this can be done or can be observed is in AI ethics initiatives. However, there are some problems and limitations of AI ethics initiatives, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in the discussion as well, but I briefly mentioned them here. First of all, there's the aspect of who is involved in and influencing the development of ethical guidelines for AI. Immediately, there's a problem of diversity and inclusion. Research has revealed how the development of AI ethics is concentrated in Europe, North America, and a few other countries. The global South is often absent in these discussions. Also, how representative are these expert panels who are developing the guidelines? And do they really include are they really representative of the groups in society who will be influenced and impacted by AI applications? Of course, we should also not be blind for the corporate influence on AI ethics initiatives, where a lot of projects are either sponsored openly or not by big tech. I'm quickly gonna move over to the second aspect, which is the problem of the speed of technological development. Of course, the development of ethical guidelines takes time, and there's a question whether this can be proactive rather than reactive. There's also a problem about AI ethics washing, which refers to the practice of exaggerating an organization's interest in promoting beneficial AI systems, aiming to highlight their commitment to ethical behavior, which is then used as a means to obfuscating their abandonment of their legal obligations. And last, a major challenge is about how to move from AI ethics to AI policies. But we can talk about this later on. Very quickly, to finish up here, so in order to deal with the negative consequences of economic power concentration and hegemonic influence of symbolic power, AI ideology, we need to find ways of bringing social power back into the discussion. And social power basically refers to power rooted in the capacity to mobilize people for cooperative, voluntary, collective actions. So a radical perspective to AI means examining AI through the lens of power and asking how we can bring real change for the better. A radical democratization of AI is necessary to avoid power inequalities and to establish AI that transforms society and enables human participation. In the book AI for Everyone, I outlined 3 main principles. AI should be accessible to everyone. AI should represent everyone, and AI should be beneficial to everyone. And just to finish up, okay, having introduced these principles, how do we move from here? So I think a first step in the democratization of AI should be in altering the capitalist discourses about AI. Rather than only considering it as a driver behind economic growth, we should consider it AI and its infrastructures as a computational public utility or even a communal utility, which is subject to democratic control. So this means that society and its communities can be involved in determining what services can or should be automated or not, and for what purposes. And then secondly, how can we create a movement and mobilize around the radical democratization of AI? Ivana Bartoletti asks in this context why we don't have an anti-AI movement similar to an anti-nuclear power movement, because there's some interesting links. So just to finish up here, rather than a defensive movement against AI, I argue for mobilization in support of radical democratization of AI. And the latter then demands creating more awareness of the risks and advantages of AI, but also including in the debate people and groups who are involved in the development of AI, but also, and more importantly, who are impacted by its implementation. Thank you very much.
The questions, I'm realizing that I don't have the mic, and I said that I wanted to take questions. So, anyone have short clarification question for Pieter? Please come closer and to ask your question, please. Any questions for Pieter? Thank you very much, Pieter, for this. So I'll let you some time to come down if you have questions. Thank you very much, Pieter, for this really interesting talk about power, which is one of the most important concepts to talk about here in relation with AI, and also for bringing a critical but constructive perspective. Thank you very much. So we have 2 questions. Please keep them short, clarification questions.
I was afraid that I only raised existential questions for now. But thanks, there's some other questions as well.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering what you suggest in the end of your presentation about radical democratization of AI. Would that mean fighting the ideology or shifting the current ideology that you've described?
Well, I'm sure it includes both of them. But first of all, accepting that there's a lot of ideology happening in AI. It's both, behind AI, tech solutionism, ideas of tech solutionism and technology will automatically, bring solutions for all our problems. So that's one thing. But also within AI, how AI is a driver for ideology. So it starts with acknowledging the ideological power, and then, I think we need to try to understand it and also try to influence and change it. And I think that's also, I'm sure we'll come back in the discussion. Ideology and power, I think, in my view, is not enough considered in all these AI ethics initiatives. And I think we need to talk about it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi. Not sure it's not an existential question, but I'll try. I agree that you've been talking about the AI ethics initiative and ethics watching and everything, but as you propose the democratization of AI, is there still a place for ethics, or does ethics still have a role, or it's mainly or exclusively political? It might be a greater question, but
it is a bit of an existential question, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this. Sure, there is. I'm not saying that we should abandon the project of AI ethics, but we should be critically, in analyzing them. Also, I'm aware when I present the 3 principles, they're also quite existential, if you like. But we need to be aware of the limitations of ethics, and I think part of that is. I'm putting full disclosure. We need to talk about the system. That's why I call for radical democratization. What's behind that, and who is organizing these, who's leading these debates that do that with a specific agenda, right? We need to acknowledge that and also, influence that. But ethics in itself alone will not create like a better AI. So surely there are limitations with this. But we also need to, move beyond AI ethics. And that's policy, that's mobilization, that's changing the discourses. In this conference yesterday also, a lot of the examples were about ChatGPT. As much as there are limitations and problems with it, it also raises more awareness of, what's around AI and the hype. And I think that's also an opportunity. I think there's much more public discussion now around AI and all the promises and the challenges about this, rather than all these AI ethics initiatives. So something about public awareness, the media play an important role in this as well. But I think I stop here so that I have something to say in the discussion afterwards as well.
So our next speaker is David Leslie. David was supposed to be with us, but unfortunately he couldn't for personal reasons. But fortunately, he's there online. So David Leslie, hi David. David Leslie is the Director of Ethics and Responsible Innovation Research at the Alan Turing Institute and Professor of Ethics, Technology and Society at Queen Mary University of London. Before joining the Turing Institute, he taught at Princeton's University Center for Human Values, where he also collaborated with their Center for Information Technology Policy on technology ethics, political philosophy, and human values on the theme of ethical dilemmas in AI governance. David's current research focuses on digital ethics, algorithmic accountability, explainability, and the social and ethical impacts of machine learning and data-driven innovations. So you can see that he's right on the topic too. David will, his presentation is titled Rescaling AI Normativities. So David, I'll leave you the floor for 15 minutes. You won't see me telling you that the 15 minutes is over. So maybe at one point I'll have to come back to the mic and we'll take 1 or 2 short questions. Thank you, David.
Sounds great. I will try to respect the time limits. And let me also just express alongside Pieter solidarity for those who are involved in industrial action in the UK today, fighting for the future of education. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about the temporality of AI normativities, in particular, to look critically at the temporal framings that are all too often predominant among AI ethics initiatives and broader academic representations of AI technology itself. Over the last decade, much of the growing academic literature on digital rights and AI normativities has been characterized by a nearsighted focus on the big data revolution, the second machine age, the rise of surveillance capitalism, to name a few. Such a cramped temporal lens, we might say, runs the risk of reverting to modes of tech-centered short-sightedness that can impair researchers' visions of the past, the present, and the future. It can impair understanding of the past by concealing longer-term socio-historical patterns of inequity that have cascading effects on the data innovation ecosystems of today, and that directly and indirectly influence the socio-technical context of data collection and use. It can impair understandings of the present by limiting levels of explanation and analysis to areas circumscribed by the narrow set of normative and social justice issues that are seen to surface specifically in current constellations of data innovation practices. And it can impair visions of the future by creating a false sense of the insuperability of the revolutionary momentum of current techno-scientific change, leaving critics feeling disempowered in the face of a creeping technological determinism. In this talk, I'll argue for the importance of rescaling the temporal dimension of AI normativities with a particular focus on algorithmic or data justice, where temporal horizons of AI normativities are appropriately widened. Slower and more subtle patterns of injustice and ethical harm become more discernible. This can bring into focus how longer-term legacies of inequality, discrimination, and oppression have both shaped the history of applied statistical and computational techniques of social administration, and ultimately how these have been drawn into contemporary data work. The temporal parameters of algorithmic justice, the algorithmic justice lens, are crucial for determining the horizons of its problem space, i.e., what issues and challenges algorithmic justice confronts, how the range of these issues are delimited, and where they're seen to arise. For instance, narrow temporal parameters, which locate the concerns of algorithmic justice and AI normativity exclusively in the past few decades of planetary scale datafication and digitization, are liable to fall prey to a myopic information centrism and economism that neglects to discern the way longer-term cultural, political, and socioeconomic legacies of inequity arising over many decades or even over many centuries create path dependencies which find expression in the spectrum of algorithmic and AI injustices that emerge in contemporary networked society, where the timescale of critical analysis and theory construction in the study of AI normativity and algorithmic justice is too cramped. Crucial features of its problem space, such as histories of systemic racism and coloniality, can go missing. Where temporal horizons are appropriately widened, slower and more subtle patterns of injustice become discernible. Thomas Pogge, the philosopher, usefully makes this point about the value of broadening temporal horizons in his own discussion of what he calls the features of the present global order and how these lead to massive severe poverty. And here I'm quoting him in extenso. It is well to recall briefly that existing peoples have arrived at their present levels of social, economic, and cultural development through a historical process that was pervaded by enslavement, colonialism, even genocide. Though these monumental crimes are now past to some extent, their legacy of great inequalities would be unacceptable even if peoples were now masters of their own development. In response, it is often said that colonialism is too long ago to explain poverty and radical inequality today. But consider the 30-to-1 gap in per capita income in 1960, when Europe supposedly released the colonial yoke. Even if Africa had consistently enjoyed growth in per capita income, 1 full percentage point above Europe's, this gap rate would still be 19-to-1 today. At this rate, Africa would be catching up with Europe in 2302. Consider also how such huge economic gaps entail inequalities in the competence and bargaining power that Africans and Europeans bring to bear in negotiations about the terms of their interactions. Relations structured under so unequal conditions are likely to be more beneficial to the stronger party, and thus tend to reinforce the initial economic inequality. This phenomenon surely plays some role in explaining why the gap in per capita income has actually widened to over 40-to-1, showing that since supposed decolonization, average annual growth in per capita income was much lower in Africa than in Europe, and I'm unquoting. Poca's argument for widening the temporal lens of inequality considerations to allow for a more comprehensive vision of the sources of wide-scale poverty is intended to sharpen the case for global redistribution by linking richer countries in the global north to the longer-term patterns of inequity that have led to the deprivation in poorer ones. This temporal relocation of the examination of massive severe poverty is meant to provide an analytical leverage for advancing the global justice perspective. A similar search for analytical leverage in the case of algorithmic justice should prompt us to look more critically at the reasons behind tendencies in the current study of AI normativities to focus on too narrow of a timescale. We might say that such nearsightedness is symptomatic of what might be called, following Evgeny Morozov, AI epochalism, epoch meaning the time frame. This is the implicit assumption that there is, for better or worse, something unprecedented or exceptional about our contemporary period of technological change. In particular, AI epochalism emerges in the perception that our own epoch of rapidly accelerating datafication, digitization, and informaticization is unique, unparalleled, and thus worthy of concerted or undivided attention. While there's undoubtedly virtue in interrogating the degree to which present-day digital innovation has brought human society to an inflection point, AI epochalism can have a hampering effect on the historical self-understanding of algorithmic justice and AI normativity itself. A belief in the singularity or novelty of informational or surveillance capitalism, on the political economy of datafication, etc., can unduly fetter researchers' notions of the appropriate commencement point and historical arc of relevant algorithmic justice concerns. To the contrary, as thinkers from Max Weber, Michel Foucault, and Ian Hacking, to Alain Dessoisières and Theodore Porter have all argued, sociohistorical processes of increasing quantification, measurement, categorization, datafication, and calculation have a centuries-long history marked by the mobilization of enumerative and statistical techniques as a means of scientific management, biopolitical normalization, and the exercise of state power and administrative control. The story of algorithmic justice and injustice in this sense really begins with the way that the emergence of modern technologies of enumeration and methods of data collection in the 18th century developed into the techniques of social control, normalization, and biopower that would soon culminate in the rise of social statistics, eugenics, and the population-level logics of classification and discrimination. The avalanche of printed numbers and the statistical enthusiasm that appears in the early 19th century, largely under the auspices of the modern administrative state, heralded a novel approach to the data-driven governance of the social body, what Foucault called the biopolitics of population, the increasing concentration on amassing social data and incessant counting of people, practices, and things through inventories, censuses, labor surveillance, actuarial capture, administrative processes, and the like, not only signaled the harnessing of a quantitative sense of control over living bodies, populations, and resources, it also signaled the widespread marshaling of the credibility of numbers, technologies of trust, and the mathematical purport to objectivity to construct categories into which individual groups could be sorted or organized, and to produce socio-politically efficacious apparatuses of quantified knowledge and information control. All this was of massive biopolitical, economic, and sociocultural consequence. Indeed, the dark side of this history of the rise of social calculation is rife with patterns of inequality, inequity, and injustice that would seem fundamental to the algorithmic justice story itself. In the context of antebellum America, the data practices of methodological measurement and quantitative management taken up by so-called book farmers on southern plantations subjected enslaved men, women, and children to brutal and dehumanizing forms of experimentation aimed at optimizing labor productivity. Alongside this, the development of racial statistics soon led to the quantitative underwriting of theories of racial superiority and eugenics. Reverberations of such a conversion of racialization, datafication, and quantification also found their way into mainstream biomedical practices, as evidenced, for instance, in the long and continuing racist history of the deployment of the spirometer to quantify racial difference, or in the regimes of race-based human experimentation that materialized in US medical and military domains during the 20th century. On the colonial front as well, as Arjuna Padarai, following Edward Said, has observed, threads of enumeration, classification, and exoticization were interwoven into, as Padarai writes, a single colonial project. This can be seen across diverse strategies of colonial administration, from the manner in which the British colonial state fostered regimes of group dissension and enervation through the divisive classificatory logics of the Indian census, to the way that othering of colonized people as exotic communities enabled colonial rulers to press the relentless measurement and quantification of them into the service of social control and aggressive cultural erasure and reform. As Padarai puts it, quote, numbers gradually became part of the illusion of bureaucratic control and a key to the colonial imaginaire, in which countable abstractions, both of people and of resources, at every imaginable level and for every conceivable purpose, created the sense of a controllable indigenous reality, unquote. Taken together, these examples enjoin a programmatic widening of the temporal lens of the study of AI normativities and algorithmic justice. They urge researchers and practitioners to acknowledge the deep history of datafication and to systematically integrate such an appreciation with interrogations of the data innovation infrastructures and practices of the present. This is not to say, of course, that only the long history matters in the study of AI normativities and algorithmic justice more generally, or that close attention to the major technoscientific and socio-technical changes underway today is misdirected. It is to say, however, that we must pay heed both to the long social evolutionary histories of protracted inequities, paroxysms of injustice, and slow violence, and to the compressed histories of present transformation. In Ian Hacking's words, the world knows both revolution and evolution. Both must be appropriately scrutinized, and the lessons of an unflinchingly interrogated past must be reflectively applied to the problems of the present and the future. That's it.
Thank you very much, David, for helping us to widen our lens when we look at AI normativities, and also for respecting your time beautifully. I will invite everyone who, not everyone, if those who have questions, I'll take one or two brief, specific questions for David. Please come to the mic if you have questions that are not existential. Well, of course,
existential. Existential is okay too.
Yeah, I know. I just told them that we needed to keep the existential questions for the end, and for sure, your presentation does bring up lots of existential questions. So no specific questions. I had one. You started answering it, which was knowing that. You know, I think it's very important to widen our lens. So what do we do more concretely? You started answering it. We're going to continue later. And since I see that Vincent has a question, then I'll let him the mic.
Okay, hi. I'm sorry, I have a very general question. So the general question is this: I'm a bit worried about the whole style of your discussion, because you mentioned a lot of ethical concerns that I totally agree with, especially colonialism is something that's heavily under-discussed in the UK, I think, and other matters. But I wonder, so to speak, in what capacity are you doing that? You see, so you have ethical and political views, and you're trying to do something good, which is fine, obviously, but is that part of your academic work, or how does that relate to something that you will try to say with some kind of authority as an academic expert on so and so? So it's obviously, it's good to say something about your background, your intentions, and so on when you're doing academic work. I think that's important. But I was trying to imagine what would happen if somebody would be, I don't know, a Nazi or something with a completely different political perspective from mine, right? Which didn't happen in this case. But let's assume that somebody would actually do this and sort of explain that political view to me. And I would think that's completely misplaced. Why is he doing that? So I don't want to say it's okay in your case because I happen to agree with what you're saying, but I'm a bit worried about that relationship between sort of the political stance and the academic stance. Maybe you can explain that a bit more. Thanks.
I mean, I think I might question maybe the premise of your comment, which is to say, I think from my perspective, the critical interrogation of the past is a scholarly endeavor, and one that is, in a sense, for me, the highest point of my academic freedom, right? Which is to say, to look critically and in a positionally aware way at the way that certain longer-term socio-historical and cultural patterns might be informing the present. For me, this is a scholarly interrogation. It's not, as you say, a political interrogation. Now, that's not to say that scholarship itself isn't informed by what Charles Taylor would call a value slope, right? Charles Taylor, for instance, talks about how in any social scientific endeavor, because it's an interpretive endeavor, it secretes a value slope. We bring our values to the academic work that we do. And there's no way we can't step out of that interpretive circle, of that circle of bringing our own kind of frames to the problems. But what we can do, and I think that this maybe speaks to the connecting point of the political and the scholarly, is we can always aim to broaden the horizons of the frames that we bring to bear in our academic work. Gadamer talks about he says he calls it Horizonbeschmelzung, the fusion of horizons. And so for me, who in all fairness comes from the US, has been raised up in the US academic system, and is aware of the privileges that I've had, my horizon fusion in my scholarship is becoming more aware of colonial legacies and being more self-critical of my own privilege. And so for me, that's the highest point of my potential as an academic to bring whatever truth I can to the table in giving these types of talks. So my view is that it's not, I don't think that I wouldn't make the same distinction that you started with.
Thank you, David, and we'll continue the conversation later. Our next speaker is Luke Stark. He's assistant professor at the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at the University of Western Ontario. He was previously in Montreal, actually, as a postdoctoral researcher in the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics group at Microsoft Research. And maybe that explains why he made his slides bilingual, which is great. Thanks, Luke. He was also a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Sociology at Dartmouth College and a fellow and affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. He completed his PhD in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University under the supervision of Ellen Nissenbaum, and holds an honors BA and MA in History from the University of Toronto. His talk will be titled Competing Governance Approaches for AI, from Ethics Code to Inference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison, and thank you to the organizers of the event for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be back in Montreal. And I'm also really very pleased by the order of the speakers, because I'd like you to take almost everything that the previous two speakers have said as something I agree with, and I can build on that from there. So that's really convenient. Okay. Yeah. So as Allison just mentioned, the title of my talk is Competing Governance Approaches for AI, from Ethics Codes to Inference. The kind of background for this talk for me is having been a doctoral student and then sort of postdoctoral researcher over the span of time through which AI ethics became a kind of hot topic of public concern. I really often point to this article. It's from the New York Times, September 16th, 2016, by the well-known tech journalist John Markoff. That sort of, points to this shift both in the public conversation around technology from going from sort of big data to AI, and also, this shift to a way in which tech companies, the big tech companies that we've already heard about, began to take an active role in articulating the need or the desire for quote unquote real ethics, as opposed to the fake ones, that for the kind of systems that they were developing. And this initiative came out of a number of things happening at Stanford at the time, the 100 years on a study on artificial intelligence, and also work on the Partnership for AI. So there are particular historical reasons why ethics became the frame through which we're thinking about the broader set of values and norms for these technologies in society that I think I was interested in. Around this time, I began working with these two wonderful colleagues who I want to acknowledge in this talk. These are Daniel Green, who is at the University of Maryland, and Anna Lauren Hoffman, who's at the University of Washington. And both of these folks have been super influential in my thinking, and we've been thinking together collaboratively for several years and across several papers about the kind of questions around the ethics of AI, and particularly what the philosopher or sociologist of labor and work, Gabriel Abend, calls the quote-unquote moral background of AI. Right? So this is not thinking about the specific values that any one ethics code produces or talks about. It's talking more about the kind of meta way in which these codes ask us to think about values and ethics in the first place. This is just a little list of the sort of papers that I think make up this investigation. It began with work on data ethics and data ethics codes. So this is sort of why we were well placed in 2016 to start thinking about AI ethics, because there had been a whole conversation in 2014 and 2015 about data ethics and an ethics code for data scientists. And so we were a little taken aback when suddenly everyone stopped talking about data ethics and started talking about AI ethics. As we were working on this piece, Anna and I, we were engaging with Dan, a friend and colleague, and he pointed to, at the time, I think there were only 7 or 8 of these AI ethics codes. Of course, there are now hundreds. And he suggested we kind of perform a similar analysis of those documents, which we did. And then finally, and I think this is going to sort of frame my talk today. A couple of years ago, we thought we needed to articulate the kind of broader spectrum of mechanisms for AI governance that have been proposed, right? AI ethics codes are just one set or one kind of type of governance mechanism amongst many, and so that's kind of going to be where the talk's going to go today. So I've sort of listed out here some of the many mechanisms for AI governance that we identified in our kind of little survey in 2020, right? And you'll note that ethics codes and statements of principles are just one of them. There are a number of other ways that we could understand how AI is governed, and of course the word governance and government itself has its own history and own connections to ideas of not just the state overseeing the world, but also other actors, potentially private sector actors, being involved in governance. So what are these mechanisms, right? Well, so they're technical mechanisms and tools, right? So we can think about the way that AI is designed, more or less fairly through various technical mechanisms as one form of governance. Of course, ethics codes and statements we've talked a lot about in this event and will continue to. But also, I think we would be remiss if we didn't look at the burgeoning sets of standards and voluntary forms of certification that are kind of coming out of these ethics principles, right? So the IEEE, the ISO, and other international standards-making bodies are seeking to produce, these kind of documents that allow private companies to, articulate and point to their ethical behavior. Though, of course, it's not always clear how those standards actually relate to actual practice. Of course, laws and regulations and policies are important, elements of governance as well, and in some ways the most important, but there's a wide terrain of those forms of governance. We've also heard a lot of interest from folks in the human rights space, articulating how human rights principles can support AI governance and relating, the kind of especially work on human rights principles as applied to business. The 2011 Ruggie principles, as being one way to regulate AI, one that has some kind of historical weight. Putting aside questions about the kind of history of human rights. This is a framework that is at least broadly understood, if not always honored, around the world. We also note a couple of sort of other points that are maybe less often articulated as mechanisms of governance. One of them is securitization and force majeure, right? So right, the idea that that great power competition is an important way of shaping the governance of AI systems. This has only become more evident and more obvious over the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, as relations between the United States and China have begun to deteriorate, often around technology policy, right? Around the development of hardware systems, questions around privacy and hacking, and various other things. And we point out that the securitization discourse, right, the idea that that AI is being securitized, right, framed as a security problem and thus taken out of the realm of democratic accountability, is something. This is only the latest example of how this has happened to some new technology. Right, we had these conversations very much in the general form around cybersecurity 10 to 15 years ago, and now we're repeating that in the context of AI. And finally, and I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, we identify social activism and social movements, and especially labor and labor movements, right, as forms of government or governance that potentially point to a more radical, a more communal, and a more democratic form of oversight over these technologies. Ones that I think need to be recognized as governance mechanisms, and ones which will hopefully have a big part to play in the future. So I'll come back to that. So a lot of the work that we did, Anna, Dan, and I together in this work was kind of thinking about how ethics codes, data ethics codes, some of these mechanisms of governance like standards, suggest through the way they're written, the kind of actors that they focus on, and the kind of problems they present, suggest a kind of broader moral background for contemporary AI ethics and governance. And I'm going to just give you a few examples of that moral background, or features of that moral background now. One of them is expert oversight, right? Vision statements and standards bodies are not mass mobilization documents, right? They frame ethical design as a project of expert oversight, where primarily technical and secondarily legal experts come together to articulate these concerns, right? And so, even though there often are some gestures towards, stakeholders and broader social engagement, in practice, these are very narrowly construed. Another interesting thing we've noticed across a variety of codes and other kind of documents, right, is a lack of articulation of stewardship, right? So, to make a long story short, right, stewardship is itself a problematic term. It kind of comes up in a lot of natural resource industries, right, to think about how you would responsibly manage a resource like oil or forest or something like that. And but this idea of stewardship of data, stewardship of maybe kind of public goods in the context of digital technologies is really missing from these conversations. Taking kind of a cue from the way that metaphors for big data often relate to natural resources, data being the new oil, for instance, right? We just make the point that I've been the wrong slide. That's the expert oversight slide. Stewardship. So making the point that data is the new oil, we note that exploitation of resources without stewardship, right, can have hugely problematic effects, right? And so, without this conversation about stewardship, we are placing people in this case, right, who are the kind of producers of most digital data and the kind of the producers of the data that AI analyzes, potentially at risk. And finally, and I think this is in some ways maybe the most important observation that we've made about the AI moral background, right, is that it's design and not business that is the locus of ethical scrutiny, right? So the idea being that in all this focus on how to design more fairly, to how to produce these systems that are best optimized, as Annette Zimmerman mentioned on Wednesday, right? This in some ways deliberately draws attention away from the broader business practices through which these technologies are used, right? And I think this jives nicely with what Pieter mentioned earlier, right, about an attempt to avoid thinking about the broader hegemonies of capitalist power and the way that AI participates and supports those hegemonies. And then I think the other thing that we've really noticed, and this is sort of now transitioning a little bit more to my own current work, right, is to sort of vehemently agree with David, the way that these systems reinscribe and perpetuate and often expand existing forms of classification that perpetuate and deepen forms of inequality, right? So we have a variety of claims that AI systems can do things like predict whether guests are psychopaths for Airbnb, or they can suggest if you're depressed if you use Instagram, and they also even make sort of kind of even more nefarious claims about things like criminality or sexual orientation, right? The idea that you can predict these interior traits from exterior factors, right? And as you should all know, right, this idea of predicting interior traits from exterior factors, right, is the definition of the now discredited pseudosciences of physiognomy and phrenology, right? Sciences that have supported kind of some of the worst successes of scientific racism and colonial exploitation over the last 200 years, right? This is historical fact. This is not political. And so when we have papers like this one, right, that makes claims about producing, kind of predicting criminality from faces, we have to interrogate, right, the ways in which these kind of long-standing classificatory logics are not just being built into AI systems, but are being kind of spread more widely and more comprehensively by AI systems. So the conclusion that I think we come to, and I certainly come to out of this set of works, right, is that the current moral background of AI presents a kind of deterministic vision of society best managed through certain kinds of individualized, profit-driven technical and design expertise in which human classification is tolerated and even celebrated, right? And if this is, sort of a definition of kind of neoliberal capitalism, well, it's probably not an accident either, right? And, I think what the obvious conclusion from this diagnosis is that this moral background is incompatible with a fully inclusive, equitable, democratic, and just society. So what are we going to do about it? Well, I think one thing we can do about it is pay much more attention to the ways in which social movements and labor movements are taking, trying to bring this kind of sense of justice to AI in the workplace, in workplaces and tech. And we can also pay attention to the ways in which social movements like, for instance, the Movement for Black Lives and Data for Black Lives are articulating ways to shape policy with an eye towards historical injustice. And finally, I think we can also think about creative and novel ways to regulate AI systems. For instance, how to think about inferential logics that have underpinned systems like physiognomy and phrenology in the past, and how we can regulate at the level of inference as opposed to the level of kind of technical capacity. So I look forward to the rest of the conversation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luke. Any short clarification questions about Luke's very interesting presentation? You've seen that we're coming from higher and coming closer to the more concrete issues and dilemmas, so which is really interesting. So,
thank you. Okay. So from what I gather from your expose is that the key is not a single set of regulation or governance, but mainly an entire spectrum of governance, and not just so we need this one or this one, but it's the entire spectrum that is useful in every case, or is that something a bit widely implement?
Yeah, I think that's right. And what I would say is I think that an attention to the ways that different mechanisms can work together and are working together is the key, right? I mean, yes, you won't always need to think about standards if you're in a maybe non-industrial space, but for instance, but I think the recognition both that these different forms of governance do work together, and also that they can work together for particular ends or particular purposes, right? So for instance, right, you can think about the ways that law and technical mechanisms can work together to support each other, for what I would say good or bad, right? A classic example is digital rights management, right? You can pass laws against digital rights management or against digital piracy all you want, but if you have no way to enforce that via, technical takedowns or lawsuits or those systems or digital locks, those laws aren't going to go very far. So I think, right, so you can think about those, the technical and the legal, or the technical and the social, working together for particular purposes. And for me, I'd like to see the technical and the legal working together towards the values of justice and democratization.
Hi, Luke. So a very short question, actually, if you can come back to the slide just before. Yeah, so can you just give us some examples of inference in AI systems and how we can regulate through those?
If I could do that very quickly, I'd be a lot further along in this project. But so for instance, right, physiognomy and phrenology are good examples, right? So let's say the idea that you can take a large number of pictures of the face of various people, and you can use AI to predict their sexual orientation, right? That's a kind of inference. And I think there's been a lot of critique of systems like that. I think, we can draw on the history of physiognomy and phrenology as well as the kind of the, really drawing on the logics of abductive logic or inductive logic underpinning those systems to say categorically that physiognomy doesn't work, right? We just know, we can say this, we know this. These kind of conjectural judgments are not possible to scale precisely because of the relationship between particular individuals and a general population. And I think if you can say that, it means you can head off the development of a lot of these systems if that evidence is taken as valid by the people developing them.
Thank you so much, Luke. Thank you for the questions. So our next speaker is Bilel Benbouzid. He's a lecturer in sociology at Université Paris-Est. And after training as a public works engineer, he completed his doctoral thesis in the sociology of science on crime-fighting technologies. After his dissertation, he conducted research on predictive policing while gradually orienting his work towards computational social sciences. Today, he's more broadly interested in questions related to the regulation of artificial intelligence. So Bilel has this, practical experience and this theoretical perspective too that he's going to bring together to talk about 4 normative tensions in the regulation of AI and the problem of controlling not AI, but its political development.
Bonjour à tous, donc je vais parler en français. Merci beaucoup pour cette invitation, je suis vraiment ravi d'être ici. Et donc je vais vous présenter le résultat de mon travail. Donc, je suis sociologue, ingénieur de formation, mais sociologue des sciences. On peut dire aussi un peu anthropologue, puisque la question qu'on se pose dans le laboratoire d'où je viens, c'est on essaye de faire une anthropologie politique des controverses autour des sciences. À côté de moi, dans mon labo, il y a des gens qui bossent sur les pesticides, d'autres qui bossent sur le climat, d'autres qui bossent sur la toxicologie, sur l'agriculture. Et moi, je suis un peu le monsieur IA dans ce laboratoire. Et ce qui est assez étonnant, c'est que peu importe tous ces sujets, on découvre à peu près les mêmes questions, les mêmes effets politiques. Et donc l'IA n'est pas une exception dans les grandes questions politiques sur les sciences. Le point de départ de mon enquête, donc c'est une enquête que j'ai débutée il y a 3 ans sur la manière dont on encadre et on régule l'intelligence artificielle. C'est d'abord la question du pacing problem, c'est le rythme de la technique par rapport au droit, donc le fameux droit qui est légèrement en retard par rapport à la technique, même si ce n'est pas tout à fait vrai. Le dilemme de Colin Rizk, qui est un dilemme célèbre, qui dit que pour contrôler le contrôle social des techniques, il y a un dilemme, c'est que si on veut pouvoir les contrôler, il nous faut de l'information sur ces techniques. Pour avoir de l'information sur ces impacts, il faut la mettre en place. Et aussitôt qu'on l'a mis en place, elle crée des effets de dépendance qui fait qu'on n'arrive plus à s'en séparer, donc c'est un dilemme, et qui fait qu'on a du mal à la contrôler. Donc la technique aurait une spécificité, c'est celle d'être difficilement contrôlable politiquement. C'est ce que Colin Rizk a montré. Et puis, ce qui implique une sorte de déterminisme technologique. Et au fond, quand j'ai commencé mon enquête, je me suis rendu compte que tous les acteurs étaient au courant de ce point de départ. Ce n'est pas quelque chose que le sociologue montre. Et ils se posent tous la même question. Comment est-ce qu'on peut essayer de poser des limites sur le développement de l'IA afin qu'elle s'accorde avec l'idée de ce que nous sommes et du monde qu'on a envie de bâtir? Mais dans cette question, il y a un problème, c'est le « nous ». Qui est ce « nous » et qui est en fait assez pluriel. Et donc quand j'ai commencé à enquêter, l'image est volontairement floue, c'est que c'est tout de suite très compliqué. Il y a plus de 400 institutions ici qui parlent d'IA. Alors vous avez à la fois les milieux transhumanistes, Future of Life Institute, tout un ensemble d'organisations. Puis de l'autre côté, vous avez toutes les ONG, Access Now, Algorithmic Watch, vous avez la Commission européenne, des standards internationaux, ISO, des standards professionnels. Il y a près de acteurs qui aujourd'hui débattent. Et quand on commence à enquêter sur ça, qu'est-ce qu'on découvre? On découvre une lutte politique. Et que la seule réalité derrière tout ça, c'est que la réalité est un enjeu de lutte. Et en tant que sociologue politique, mon objectif, ça va être essayer de vous donner à comprendre les luttes qu'il y a derrière cet enjeu de régulation. Le point de départ, d'abord, c'est intelligence artificielle. Ce mot qu'on n'a pas vraiment défini et qui est en fait une sorte de serpent à deux têtes. Parce que le mot, si on y réfléchit bien, le syntagme nominal IA, qu'est-ce que c'est? C'est une figure de style. C'est un cas de syllabes en rhétorique. C'est-à-dire qu'on dit la même chose avec le sens propre et le sens figuré. Il y a le sens propre, qui est l'IA, les systèmes technologiques bien concrets, les algorithmes, les logiciels. Et puis il y a l'IA, cette espèce de truc un peu abstrait, on ne sait pas trop ce que c'est. On pourrait dans les interventions qu'il y a eu hier, par exemple, de Thierry Ménissier, on aurait pu quasiment, quand il a utilisé la métaphore du Léviathan, c'est un peu l'IA comme on pourrait dire Dieu, comme on pourrait dire l'Église, l'État, espèce d'entité comme ça qui pourrait gouverner. Et donc c'est ces deux têtes-là, quand on dit on régule l'IA, qu'est-ce qu'on régule? On régule la tête large ou est-ce qu'on régule la tête très concrète? Quand j'ai commencé à enquêter, je me suis rendu compte qu'en fait, il y a un trouble autour de ça. Et les lois qui sont en cours de construction, elles ne savent pas trop ce qu'elles essayent de saisir. Il y a un débat, il y a un combat pour savoir ce qu'on essaye de saisir. Alors, tout l'enjeu de mon enquête, c'est de montrer quelles sont les différentes prises, et la notion de prise, elle est importante en sociologie pragmatiste, que l'on a sur le réel, les prises sur l'IA. D'accord? Et on va voir qu'il y a plusieurs manières d'avoir des prises sur l'IA. Ce qu'on peut faire, je ne sais pas si c'est lisible, oui, c'est assez lisible, on peut tracer un axe. Les sociologues sont un peu comme les algorithmes du machine learning, ils aiment bien réduire les dimensions et projeter le monde sur un axe en 2D. Et on peut tracer un axe comme la forme d'une analyse en composantes principales, pour ceux qui connaissent un peu la statistique, et on met d'un côté la tête abstraite, qui renvoie grosso modo à l'IA comme domaine, et puis la tête concrète, le service, le produit. Et puis, on peut dire qu'il y a deux formes de contrôle en compétition. Il y a un contrôle abstrait et un contrôle concret. Et ce qui est intéressant, c'est que vous pouvez positionner les acteurs dans chacun de ces cadrans, et chaque arène renvoie une forme de normativité spécifique. Et je vais essayer très rapidement de vous parler des formes de normativité différentes qu'il y a dans ces arènes. Et chaque arène renvoie, et ça c'est une notion qui vient de Bruno Latour, qui est on va dire le philosophe qui encadre un peu ma manière de travailler, c'est des modes d'existence de l'intelligence artificielle qui sont différentes à chaque fois. L'IA, elle existe de plusieurs manières différentes. Elle existe, on va le voir, fictionnellement, elle existe moralement, elle existe techniquement, qui est une de ces formes d'existence, et elle existe juridiquement. Et sur le réseau, pour voir comment elle se déploie dans chacun de ces modes d'existence, ça permet de comprendre la controverse, ça permet de comprendre à quoi on tient, quelles sont les valeurs qu'il y a derrière l'IA, et surtout, ça permet moi, en tant qu'enquêteur, de créer un cadre pour une sorte de diplomatie technique dans ce grand combat, pour mieux essayer de comprendre donc, ce à quoi on tient. Voilà, ça c'est une manière de parler qu'on a dans les sociologies pragmatistes. Alors, dans le premier cadran, je vais aller vite, on découvre qui? On découvre tout un ensemble d'acteurs qui imaginent l'IA comme quelque chose de complètement spéculatif. C'est la fameuse superintelligence. Mais ce qui est hyper intéressant, c'est que eux, leur outil, pour parler de ça, et c'est la fiction. La fiction dans le sens de la science-fiction, des récits fictifs. Imaginez-vous que dans ce grand débat, on pense que, et en effet, pour avoir une prise sur l'IA, le meilleur moyen, c'est d'utiliser des récits fictionnels. Parce que c'est l'idée que la fiction est une manière d'approfondir nos connaissances sur le monde. Alors ça vous rappelle des cours de littérature, hein, le rapport entre les romans et la fiction. Quand on observe, on voit l'usage, par exemple, le financement de films de science-fiction de la part du Future of Life Institute sur les armes autonomes. Mais ce n'est pas seulement la fiction sous un format cinématographique, il y a des jeux vidéo qui sont développés par ces acteurs-là. Et il y a aussi une contre-fiction. Donc il y a un combat permanent pour dire au nom de quoi, Elon Musk, tu fais usage du cyberpunk, quand on sait ce que c'est que le cyberpunk politiquement, pour nous parler d'intelligence artificielle. Donc je reviendrai sur les débats qu'il y a à l'intérieur, mais c'est assez fascinant de voir que la fiction, elle est autant légitime pour avoir une prise sur l'IA que les discours les plus techniciens sur cet outil. Mais contre cet espace-là, il y a un autre espace qui est l'arène numéro 2, qui est celui des scientifiques. Les scientifiques les plus sobres. Et c'est très intéressant de voir qu'en 2009, bien avant l'Asylomar de 2017, qu'Elon Musk a financé notamment, il y a eu un premier Asylomar avec Eric Horowitz à sa tête, qui était le directeur de la recherche de chez Microsoft, qui lui disait « mais toute cette bande-là de Kurzweil et autres sont des fous. Et nous, on va remettre le débat un peu à sa place, nous, en tant que scientifiques rigoureux, et nous, on va invoquer l'imaginaire d'Asilomar, qui est l'Asilomar de la recherche en génétique des années 70, qui a posé un moratoire sur la recherche sur la génétique. Mais qu'est-ce qu'on dit, nous, de cet Asilomar, de ce moment Asilomar en sociologie des sciences? On dit que c'est surtout ce qu'il ne faut pas faire. Pourquoi? Parce que c'est le moment où les scientifiques nous disent c'est nous qui savons où sont les risques, ne vous inquiétez pas, nous allons gérer les risques et laisser la recherche aller au plus loin, mais on encadrera les risques. Donc c'est eux qui définissent, encore une fois, la politique de la science. Mais c'est ce qui s'est passé. Mais en fait, dans cet espace-là, aujourd'hui, dans l'arène numéro 2, vous avez tous les standards techniques. Vous avez toutes les grandes entreprises qui ont déjà apporté toutes les solutions aux enjeux éthiques. Si vous prenez une entreprise comme IBM, elle a fait les machines qui permettent aujourd'hui de certifier. On sait certifier. Les grandes boîtes de consulting, comme Deloitte par exemple, offrent des solutions très claires pour rendre vos machines certifiables en anticipant la loi européenne. Donc dans cet espace-là, on a une vision très solutionniste des enjeux éthiques. Contre cet espace, on va dire qu'à l'arène numéro 3. C'est l'arène où, par exemple, moi je mettrais volontiers mon collègue Luc ou encore même David Leslie. C'est-à-dire c'est un espace qui s'est construit autour d'une conférence qui est assez fameuse, qui s'appelle Fairness in Machine Learning, FACT. C'est une conférence. Et là, la définition de l'IA, ce n'est pas l'IA comme super-intelligence, ce n'est pas l'IA comme un agent dans un monde ouvert, c'est l'IA comme système socio-technique. D'accord? Eux, ils définissent l'intelligence artificielle de cette manière-là. C'est un système socio-technique. Et donc, on revient à quelque chose de concret, un produit, mais qui est déployé dans la société. Et ce qui est assez étonnant dans cet espace-là, c'est que David Leslie mentionnait Ted Porter tout à l'heure ou Alain Desrosières, c'est que la quantification est en train de changer de statut. À l'objectivité mécanique des statisticiens, alors c'est un truc un peu sophistiqué ça, du 18e et 19e siècle, qui avaient des valeurs de neutralité, parce que leur expertise était menacée, c'était une tactique, ils ont essayé de construire des stats en disant nous sommes neutres. Ben, à l'intérieur de cette sphère-là, on retrouve toute l'épistémologie du point de vue d'une Dana Haraway, et ils sont en train de construire une forme d'objectivité qui est plutôt celle du jugement exercé, où ils essayent de redonner un pouvoir interprétatif aux data scientists lorsqu'ils font des machines. Et il y a toute une épistémologie nouvelle qui se construit dans cet espace-là, qui est assez fascinante à analyser. Grosso modo, il y a des controverses assez importantes. Comment on met John Rawls dans la machine, mais surtout, comment on met John Rawls dans la machine, mais en gardant en tête toute l'épistémologie de Dana Haraway, c'est-à-dire que si on veut être scientifique, il faut avoir assumé un certain point de vue pour dire les choses rapidement. Puis il y a le dernier espace où l'intelligence artificielle devient un segment techno-économique. C'est un segment techno-économique, ça c'est la Commission européenne. Nous les Européens, nous sommes les champions du monde du néolibéralisme. Nous le fabriquons, nous lui donnons sa matérialité et son encadrement le plus sophistiqué. Et l'Europe, c'est un formidable marché. Et qu'est-ce qu'elle est en train de faire l'Europe? Elle est en train de faire l'instrument de la mise en compétition des systèmes d'IA. Et pour elle, l'IA, ce sont des produits. Une liste infinie de produits. De la même manière qu'il y a une liste infinie de médicaments. C'est comme ça qu'ils se sont battus. Et donc, il y a eu des bagarres énormes pour savoir c'est quoi l'IA. Et les gens, les Européens, de la Commission européenne ont décidé que ce serait vraiment la chose la plus réduite possible. Ils ont même essayé à un moment donné de la définir comme étant seulement le machine learning. Et même pas l'IA symbolique, il y a encore des négociations. Donc vous voyez, eux, leur définition, elle est encore très différente. L'IA, elle existe ici, mais elle n'existe pas vraiment juridiquement, pour moi, dans cet espace-là. C'est de la régulation, mais elle est surtout en train d'exister pour faire le marché. Et donc, c'est l'installation du dogme marchand dans le droit, plus que d'autres manières d'envisager la régulation. Alors, pour aller vite, cet IA Act, c'est assez intéressant, vous savez, c'est une pyramide, mais on voit bien qu'on n'est pas en train de faire un droit classique de l'IA dans cette pyramide. En haut, ce qui est inacceptable, c'est quoi? Vous avez déjà lu ce qui est en haut inacceptable? C'est la manipulation subliminale. C'est de l'IA, la manipulation subliminale. Tout le monde peut faire. Donc, c'est le scoring social comme on le pratique en Chine. Mais ce n'est pas vraiment de l'IA. On peut faire du scoring social avec une simple calculette. C'est la maltraitance des enfants ou des personnes âgées. Bon. Donc, on voit bien qu'ils sont déjà en train de faire quelque chose d'étrange. Ils ne sont pas en train de poser les bases politiques d'une régulation de l'IA. Parce qu'ils ne veulent pas tenir compte du fait que l'intelligence artificielle contient son projet politique en soi, et ça, là-dessus, ils ont du mal à définir quelque chose. Ils ne veulent pas, en fait, définir, parce qu'ils veulent construire le marché à tout prix. Donc, la Commission européenne est complètement schizophrénique. D'un côté, elle nous dit, je vais essayer de l'encadrer, Et de l'autre côté, elle est en train de fabriquer le marché parce qu'elle essaye d'être aussi forte que les Chinois et les Américains sur le plan économique. Voilà, donc c'est ce qui se passe. Et c'est surtout que c'est Thierry Breton qui a pris la tête de ça et pas la commission justice. Donc c'est ça. Alors, il y a un cinquième espace fascinant. Eux ne veulent pas définir. Ils disent l'intelligence artificielle, on ne la définira pas. Et ça a été mentionné lors de la première séance. C'est la notion de neutralité technologique. Pourquoi définir? Si on définit, on sait que le droit sera toujours le fameux rythme un peu en retard. Donc, ils vont chercher ce concept de neutralité technologique qui est très débattu, très controversé. Les juristes comprennent bien mieux que moi ce que c'est. Mais c'est fascinant de se dire que les juristes, ils sont futés. Ils nous disent non, nous n'allons même pas définir. Donc, un enjeu définitoire qu'ils nous ne définiront pas. Et là, c'est l'enjeu des droits fondamentaux. Et donc, on a une critique de l'IA Act qui est formidable, qui est de dire l'IA Act, elle pose des obligations aux entreprises, mais elle ne donne pas des droits aux citoyens. C'est une des réactions ici, il y en a plein. C'est juste pour vous donner à comprendre qu'est-ce qui est reproché à l'IA Act. C'est cette idée qu'elle ne donne pas des droits aux individus pour saisir les cours de justice, pour défendre leurs droits fondamentaux. Alors, mais comment on fait ça? David Leslie, qui parlait tout à l'heure, qui présentait, il essaye d'imaginer des techniques pour le faire. Mais quand on regarde de plus près, on voit bien qu'il y a un manque d'imagination juridique énorme. On retombe très vite, et ça c'est mon regard peut-être un peu plus critique, dans une logique de risque. Et le paradigme du risque, même quand on va sur les droits fondamentaux, est en train d'imprégner ces logiques-là, selon moi. Bon, et sans parler des logiques de gouvernance au niveau international, où on essaye d'écarter les institutions capables de le poser. Par exemple, le Conseil de l'Europe, qui a un rôle fort en termes de droits fondamentaux, joue un rôle mineur dans la régulation aujourd'hui, alors qu'elle est censée, elle a un pouvoir contraignant, avec des conventions, et en fait, ce n'est pas du tout en train de le prendre. Alors, je vais vite. C'est la fin? J'ai un truc à dire en 2 minutes. En 2 minutes. Moi, en tant que sociologue, j'essaie de comprendre ce qui se passe. Une fois qu'on a essayé de comprendre ce qui se passe, les sociologues des sciences ont montré comment les gens du tabac ont réussi pendant longtemps à empêcher la régulation. On les a appelés les marchands de doute. Ou encore Monsanto, avec les pesticides. Leur technique, c'est de créer du doute, puisqu'il y a toujours du doute dans la science. Ah, mais quand on regarde le travail des big tech, c'est intéressant, ils ne vont pas du tout dans cette logique-là. Ce n'est pas la logique des big tobacco. Eux, leur logique, c'est de créer une sorte de confusionnisme. Alors, ce confusionnisme, je vais très vite, ça vient de la science politique, c'est l'idée que les gens d'extrême droite utilisent des arguments d'extrême gauche, toujours dans l'intérêt de l'extrême droite. Alors, que font les big tech? Dans le cadran que j'ai montré tout à l'heure, ils sont partout. Vous avez des big tech chez ceux qui pensent à l'intelligence artificielle générale, vous avez des big tech dans la fairness. Microsoft a été un grand financeur de la recherche, Google aussi. Vous avez de la big tech dans les standards, et vous avez de la big tech au niveau des lobbies du marché, parce que la big tech, en réalité, elle veut l'IA Act. Elle le veut, en réalité, parce que ça encadre. Donc ce confusionnisme nous empêche de faire de la politique de l'IA, parce qu'au fond, ils jouent sur tous les tableaux, mais toujours dans l'intérêt des grandes compagnies. Voilà. Donc ceux qui résistent à ça, il y en a quelques-uns, notamment Paul Nemitz, qui a essayé de créer un réseau, qui critique au fond tout l'esprit, je vais vite, tout l'esprit la grande critique, là, c'est Barlow sur son manifeste du cyberespace. Il le critique en disant « vous nous avez empêché de construire du droit ». Et le processus, qu'est-ce qu'on voit? On voit, et là j'en ai pour une seconde, c'est qu'au départ, les géants du web ont voulu faire de la self-régulation avec des principes éthiques qu'on a un peu critiqués, parce on s'est dit que ça allait être un truc pour les faire passer la pilule. Ensuite, il y a eu tous les standards, le soft regulation, la loi qui arrive, mais en réalité, ce qu'on voit, c'est une gouvernance de facto, c'est une gouvernance de fait. Hugging Face, qui est l'espace dans lequel tous les chercheurs en machine learning qui fabriquent des très gros modèles viennent déposer leur modèle, le transformer de GPT-3, peut-être pas celui-ci, mais en tout cas ceux de Stable Diffusion, même celui de DALI, vous pouvez trouver le transformer ici. Le modèle, il est transparent, vous avez les milliards de paramètres. Même la base de données, elle est présente ici, il y a un model card que Timmy Gebru avait proposé comme manière de réguler. Donc c'est via l'open source qu'ils sont en train d'imposer progressivement leur politique. C'est-à-dire que ce sont qui gouverne l'IA, qui est la grande question. Ça reste les ingénieurs, en fait, qui créent en permanence des formes de confusionnisme entre plusieurs manières de pouvoir encadrer l'intelligence artificielle. Voilà. Pardon pour le...
Merci Bilel, encore beaucoup de matière à réflexion. Est-ce qu'on a une ou deux questions?
Oui, merci. C'était quand même très fascinant d'un point de vue d'un administrateur public. Donc si j'en la cinquième zone, là, celle de la neutralité, c'est pas un peu hypocrite lorsque, comme vous disiez tout à l'heure, on a j'en discutais tout à l'heure, c'est un peu utopique de penser qu'on peut aller vers une neutralité alors qu'il va y avoir des instances idéologiques, soit des acteurs étatiques, soit des entreprises, comme vous avez dit, qui ont tout un peu leur don. C'est pas un peu se réfugier dans une espèce de safe space en croyant qu'on va on va être à l'abri un peu?
Alors, pour faire attention, je ne sais pas si on parle de la même chose, mais la neutralité technologique pour les juristes, ça ne veut pas dire que la technique est neutre. Ça veut dire qu'on ne définit, ce n'est pas la forme de la technique elle-même, sa nature, qui doit déterminer la manière de l'encadrer. Ça veut dire que peu importe la manière dont l'IA va se déployer, les formes qu'elle va prendre, on ne veut pas définir ce que c'est pour mieux pouvoir avoir une prise sur elle. Alors, c'est en effet une position tout à fait bizarre, on peut dire, qui est difficile à défendre, mais les juristes arrivent assez bien à la défendre. C'est la position d'un Paul Nemitz, dont je parlais tout à l'heure, qui a été l'architecte du RGPD et en Europe. Et en effet, je ne sais pas si c'est la solution, mais on voit bien que c'est une manière, en tout cas, de ne pas être à la traîne c'est réussir à avoir une prise sur l'IA qui ne nécessite pas de redéfinir le droit à chaque fois qu'il y a une nouvelle manière de penser ça. Donc c'est dans le droit d'auteur, c'est quelque chose de beaucoup utilisé, ou surtout dans les télécommunications. C'est-à-dire qu'on pense le droit des télécommunications en dehors de la manière dont les techniques de télécommunications évoluent beaucoup, changent. C'est un peu le défi qu'il propose pour pouvoir avoir une prise sur l'IA.
Très, très rapidement, merci beaucoup Bilel, je suis à 100% d'accord avec toi. Juste une petite clarification peut-être sur le vocabulaire. Tu dis les juristes, ça me dérange un peu parce que moi je ne voudrais pas être dans ce sac-là. Les chercheurs en droit remettent en cause un tas de choses comme la neutralité technologique et je pense qu'hier on l'a démontré. Peut-être plutôt les institutions porteuses du droit ou les juristes institutionnels, mais peut-être pas les chercheurs en droit, s'il te plaît. Merci.
Merci énormément, Bilel. On pourra y revenir tout à l'heure parce que c'était très riche et je pense que ça amène beaucoup de matière à réflexion pour voir maintenant qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec ça, justement. Donc, what's next? Notre dernière panéliste, j'aurais vraiment aimé qu'elle soit avec nous. Elle est très loin. Elle est en Égypte, en fait. Donc, pour elle, c'est la fin de l'après-midi. C'est Nagla Rizk. She's professor of economics and the founding director of the Access to Knowledge for Development Center at the American University in Cairo's School of Business. Hi, Nagla. Her research area is the economics of knowledge, technology, and development. Her work focuses on digital technologies and inclusion, zooming in on the governance of data and artificial intelligence, gender, gig work, and inclusive growth in Egypt, in the Middle East, and Africa. So you're going to see Nagla's going to bring us to more concrete and very specific issues, and she's going to talk about AI norms and people in the Global South, platform-mediated work as an example. Thank you so much, Nagla, for being here, and it's your turn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Allison, and thank you all. Good morning, afternoon, evening, and many thanks for the organizers for having me alongside such distinguished panelists, and especially for accommodating my participation online. And also thank you for having me speak in English. Let me also express full solidarity with Pieter and his colleagues. We are on the same side of the fence. The title of our panel is What Issues, Problems, and Challenges with AI Normative Initiatives? And I thought about it, and I chose to speak about the need for contextualization of norms to countries of the Global South. And I chose to speak about platform-mediated work as an example based on research that I'm engaged in on gig work in Egypt, which I will talk to you more about. Next. Basically, I'll tell you more about the purpose of the talk. Then I will focus on 3 points. I'll talk about AI-enabled platform-mediated work, the global narrative. I will then zoom in on realities from the Middle East and North Africa, where I come from and where I live. And then I will focus more on the points of contextualization, putting together my conclusions in the end. So as I mentioned, the purpose is to highlight the need for contextualization. I argue that the perception and the nuances of AI-driven platform-mediated work in the Global South context, they need to be addressed via alternative perspectives, ground-up, locally devised norms that also align with global ethical standards. I note the need to contextualize, adapt, develop nuanced narratives, resolve paradoxes, and harmonize regulation. My work in this area of data and AI for development started within my area in knowledge, intellectual property, technology, and development with starting and initiating the Data for Development MENA network in the Middle East and North Africa, doing research on open data for development with support from the International Development Research Center of Canada. And I wrote on the state of open data in MENA, but I really delved into what we are talking about today later on when I wrote the chapter on AI and inequality in the MENA region. I was asked to write a chapter about the region and choose a topic for the Oxford Handbook of the Ethics of AI. It was published in 2019. And I just immediately thought of choosing inequality. And as I worked on the chapter, I found myself more and more looking at the political economy of my region, which is my area. I'm a development economist, and as situating the discussion on AI in the region's political economy. So fast forward to today, right now at our center, the Access to Knowledge for Development, we are working on a number of research themes. The first is regional, for the MENA region and Africa, but for MENA, there are 3 projects that directly pertain to our discussion today. One of them is responsible governance of responsible data and AI for development in the MENA region, creating an observatory, the MENA AI Observatory. The second is that we are the regional hub for feminist AI, the Fairness in AI Research Network. And the third, which I will zoom in and talk about today, is research on new work, new forms of work in MENA, with a sort of in parallel work on fair work in the gig economy in Egypt. So this is really what I would like to talk about. This is the example I want to talk about. When we talk about platform-mediated work, immediately what comes to mind and what we know and the classification is work on the ground, the geographically tethered services. The obvious example is Uber. The second example is work on the cloud, and usually the data skills that are the skills that are required are slightly higher. So we see workers working on data annotation, translation, consultancies, design, architectural works, etc. And the more we look at these 2 forms, what comes to my mind is the familiar picture, of course, from Charlie Chaplin's movie Modern Times, where the worker is engaged in part of the value chain, and this, a very small part, and the person engaged in work doesn't really know what is being produced or why or what is the purpose, or it's just being engaged in a very small, minor process of the production. So platform-mediated work, of course, the global narrative, extremely valid, the precarity, exploitation, which is in and of itself should be a recommendation when we think of AI ethics and standards. Typically, we think of biases and power, of course, but it's very important to focus on exploitation of workers, underpayment, lack of safety, workers being treated like a machine, alienation of the worker, the fragmentation of the production process. All of this is super valid, highly relevant, everywhere, more or less, okay? But as exploitation is critical in the conversation of AI ethics and norms, how do we perceive this in the context of the Global South? And I give MENA as an example. So allow me to just take a lens and walk you very quickly to a few statistics. This is a region where the share of informal work in total employment is anywhere from 50 to 70%. All right, so you look at the map and the color codes, gets red and then eventually black. And this is where my region is on the map. Informal work, as a percentage of total employment. This is also a region where the percentage of female labor participation is the lowest in the world. 2021, it was 18%. And the percentage of female unemployment as a percentage of that labor force is the highest in the world, so almost reaching 20%. So that's one metric, the second metric we need to look at. Next, we look at the share of youth unemployment. Again, the highest in the world as a percentage of the labor force, more than 27% in 2021. More youth aged 15 to 24, not in employment, education, or training. Estimates in 2019, again, color code gets worse when it moves to red, and this is my region. All right. This is a bit old statistic, but I like it because it's indicative. About 40% of university graduates were unemployed. So you can imagine, in that context, then we start thinking about work from other angles as well. Additionally, what we find is that the jobs typically lost due to technology, AI, are usually the medium-skilled job, and I immediately link that with the university graduates to call centers. At some point, Egypt was known as an outsourcing center for call services, etc. And these young men and women are the first to lose their jobs to AI. And guess what? The highly skilled university graduates, we suffer a problem of brain drain, and I'll come back to this shortly. Then we look at the demographics of the region, and we find out that a large percentage of the population are young. So I don't like the expression "the future of work" because the future is here and now. This is what's happening. Challenges to work are happening today. So less than 40 years of age are 40%. Typically, when you go to lower age cohorts, you get even concentrated percentages in specific countries. And then what happens when you put all of this together? Youth speak up. And not far away in history, we heard this all over the streets of my hometown, and I was right there in the square with them: bread, freedom, social justice, and dignity. So the situation of work is really challenged. This is the background against which gig work is emerging. And we need to keep that in mind with all the exploitation that is there. Another statistic, about 250 million people out of 400 million across 10 Arab countries were classified as poor or vulnerable. And this is in 2019. So context matters, okay? There is a paradox here. When you speak to gig workers, and we have done research on this and continue to do research on gig workers on the streets of Cairo, they tell you this is a source of livelihood for us. This is how we make a living. This is how we get married, because this is important in this culture, right? But this is precarious work. So what is really frustrating for us is that with all its precarity, this is providing a source of livelihood. And that is something that we see. We are part of the Fair Work Research Network with Oxford Internet Institute, and we see similar results for other parts of the Global South. So exploitative and precarious as it is, platform-mediated work comes as a source of livelihood in context of informal work, soaring rates of unemployment of youth, women, and the educated, not to mention increasing poverty and exacerbated inequalities. As well, in the case of groundwork, this is another important point. A few of those platforms are local startups created by young entrepreneurs, organic created, part of a budding, healthy entrepreneurship scene that's much needed in those countries. So these platforms have the potential of providing inclusive work models if we work with them to provide decent and fair work and mitigate the typical challenges of working that happens for mainstream platforms. In fact, it tackles an issue that was mentioned earlier by Pieter, and I noted it down: market concentration. We want to encourage those young platforms. So there is tension here. We want to encourage entrepreneurship of youth rather than them taking their business to the UAE or Silicon Valley. And there are examples. Swivel was one startup that originated actually in my university and eventually went to Silicon Valley and did very well in the US, and others end up going to the UAE. So how do we resolve that tension? We want to create jobs, but they have to be decent. We want to encourage local entrepreneurs at a time where the gig work, and quite rightly so, is seen by the global standards, quite rightly so, for good reason, as exploitative. So the challenge then is, how do we govern AI-driven platform-mediated work in such contexts where work opportunities are scarce and multifaceted inequality exists and institutions weak? How can we adapt the global ethical perceptions to fit the local priorities? What other new ethical concerns emerge? I don't have all the answers, but I have a lot of questions. We have weak data protection institutions. Sometimes we don't even have data protection laws at all. There are human rights concerns. How do we deal with that? So how do we do it in a way that we can mitigate challenges? One of the projects, as I mentioned, we're working on is new work, data, and inclusion in the digital economy. It's a regional project with support from Ford Foundation. And we try in the countries that are highlighted here with partners, and we try to find those platforms, because guess what? I mean, these workers, of course, are not protected, but they're also not part of the national data landscape. They don't have a classification in the data landscape, and invisibility in data immediately means invisibility in social protection and local policy making. So I mentioned our Fair Work project. We undertook Egypt study 2021, and 2022 is actually launched next week. We did the following year study, and we did the regional study on domestic service platforms in Tunisia, Turkey, and in Egypt as well. And in a context, as I mentioned, of informality, this becomes challenging. Now, the principles, and I'll say I'm cognizant of time, I'll try to be quick. The Fair Work principles, this is the Oxford methodology that we all follow. We look at principles of fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management, and fair representation, and we score platforms. But the nice thing about this is that we interview the workers, we interview the platform management, and we go to management with provisional scoring, which is usually quite modest, if not dismal. And we work with them. We tell them, if you do this, if you take care of these points, if you provide evidence, if you make an announcement that you are going to develop this and that, your scoring will increase. So as academics, this is the only incentives we can offer. You know, we're not policymakers, but we work with policymakers and try to engage the different constituencies to improve work conditions for the workers, and actually we try to work with these, especially the local startups, and I'll show you the difference between them. The local ones are the ones who are responsive, and they see their scoring improve before we publish the final report. So these workers also have other additional struggles. As I mentioned, they're not part of the data landscape. They are not part of they're not part of the social protection. There's a cultural stigma sometimes associated with gig work. So how do we deal with that, especially with domestic service? There is a fragmentation in the local legal landscape between, tax laws, competition laws, labor laws, data protection, and they are somewhere lost in the middle. So do we pivot the narrative? How do we, prioritize the need for decent work, encouraging local startups, making sure that these platforms are not exploitative? So how we deal with this tension, I think, is an important, a critical priority that we need to think of. This is an example. These are the homegrown platforms. This is the scoring last year. This year's is coming up pretty soon. You will see in Egypt, the two top performers out of 10 are homegrown, and a similar scenario with our partners in South Africa. And these are the ones we want to work with, rather than them being, either gulped by, taken in by the large corporations, or actually flying off to other countries, and we lose this entrepreneurial potential. So again, my conclusion here is that as we centralize worker exploitation as a central, a critical part of the narrative of AI ethics and norms in AI-mediated work, we need to contextualize the perception and the approach. We work as academics with civil society, with the platforms themselves, and with policymakers to try and bring change. Now, there is plenty of room for perhaps more aggressive moves by policymakers to actually incentivize those platforms to try and mitigate all the conflicting, tax laws, competition laws, incentives, labor laws, to reach an optimum solution that could be a win-win for all. We need to resolve this paradox We need to ensure that there are livelihoods for those people against the context of the reality of what we have. We also the need for harmonization of regulation. We need to have these, different parts of regulation speaking to each other, acknowledging the existence of this new type of work, and also the conversation between the different stakeholders for context-specific solutions. One of the things we do practically and empirically is working within the Fair Work principles. Legitimately, we have a broad interpretation of some of the principles. And I'll give you a quick example. Principle 5 usually has to deal with labor unions and working through a labor union. Given that gig workers are not able to unionize, and given the political tension in my country concerning this is very much politicized, and that's another conversation that we can take, perhaps off record. We didn't stop there. We are encouraging platforms and giving them scores when they allow their workers to have creative means of organizing. They can have a Facebook group whereby they actually express their concerns and the management responds. So this is an example where they are given the point, one of the platforms. And so we work creatively, sort of adapting the standards to the region in a way that encourages and incentivizes the hope and the possibility of decent work. I was one of a contributor to Egypt's AI strategy, and one of my contributions to the strategy was actually to emphasize encouraging small entrepreneurs, giving incentives to small, not just in the platform-mediated work, but in general, in AI-driven entrepreneurship to mitigate the market concentration that we heard about earlier. So in summary, the perception and governance of AI-driven platform-mediated work in Global South contexts needs to be addressed via nuanced perspectives, ground-up locally devised norms and solutions that also align with global ethics standards. There isn't one single narrative. I think that's my message. One size does not fit all, and we need to engage and incorporate all these narratives in addressing the issue, even though the solutions are local and context specific. Pieter, I remember you mentioned earlier, you said for AI who and for whom, and allow me to add also where are these solutions happening and how do they relate to the larger context. My last word on this is that promoting livelihood is a priority, but it has to be a livelihood that needs to be decent and fair for the workers, and also allows opportunities for local entrepreneurship. So how we maintain this balance in context, like I explained, how do we resolve the tension? It is difficult, but it's not insurmountable challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nagla. Your presentation reminds us that while we need to critically think high level on AI, we also need to think about you also give us the importance of thinking about real consequences on the ground, and how do we work them both together to think about the norms and ethics around AI, which is kind of in the middle of those two levels, very different levels of critique. Just before we take a break and go on to our conversation, is there one or two short questions for Nagla? And I see two persons coming, so perfect.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about your perspective on how to further then encourage the development of a nuanced or rather localized and contextualized narratives around AI development. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Shall I answer, Allison?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes. Thank you very much for the question. I take it, I go back to something maybe was mentioned earlier by Pieter, but something that I also write about in my work is to have the different stakeholders and the different constituencies involved. So in the case of work, if you will, it's very important to listen to the workers and the platforms, the civil society, the policymakers, bring them all together not on a Zoom conversation anymore. Hopefully people can more and more meet face to face, but devise what is suitable for this form of work mediated by technology to advance. So in the case of platform-mediated work, it's bring different constituencies together. But if I take zoom out and think of this as a concept, is to bring the different people who are engaged in the development of AI, not just the experts or the technologists, but also the beneficiaries, the domain experts, the communities that are affected by AI. And we need to develop these narratives locally, but they also need to be part of a global perspective. So the global standards and the global norms are sort of sometimes are detached from what's happening on the ground. So there has to be a conversation between these two. The solution, the AI solutions and technology solutions will have to be context specific, but also domain specific. And it will only happen if it's done by different people speaking to each other. If I may give you a quick example. In our work on governance of health data, we are actually undertaking on the ground fieldwork research, trying to find out how data on women's health is governed in Egypt at the different health units, between public health units, university, hospitals, labs. We have a whole set of sample of different entities. But we're also talking to people, the people themselves, what is happening with their health data. We're trying to understand the narrative. It's very difficult, but it's not impossible. We want to understand what's happening on the ground. And we know the standards by the WHO and others. We know what is out there. So while we are studying the global standards, we're actually also trying to see what's happening on the ground, identifying the gaps, and having a conversation between the two from our end, in a way trying to synchronize these two. I hope that makes sense. But I guess my answer to you that as much as possible field work on the ground, as much as possible. And the solutions will always be specific to the domain that we are interested in. Thank you very much.
Work on the ground. Thank you so much, Nagla. Short question, short answer, please, because we need a little break and we want to have time for the discussion afterwards. So please keep your questions for later.
No problem. Sorry for my English in advance. I think you already answered part of my question, but I have a degree in economics, in innovation, and they always taught us about the creative destruction of Schumpeter. And I don't understand why in reality it doesn't work, and I have this impression that all the promises that the tech industry gave us about this, it will create other jobs and stuff, so why it doesn't work?
Thank you very much for the question. That's a big question, but let me very quickly maybe tell you my stance on this. The technology, digital technologies, more so in the case of AI, it has the two forces can happen at the same time. So what I teach a course on digital economy, and I start the course by discussing this with my students. So you can think, at some point they told us that the internet and digital technologies bring us a step closer to perfect competition, because you have many buyers, many sellers, close to perfect flow of information, low barriers to entry. So the argument here is that you can have, companies outsource the production, parts of the production, they concentrate on their core competencies, and they outsource parts of the value chain, production chain to other, to other entities, and then it's more efficient and competitive, etc. And then this narrative brought, the outsourcing argument and the countries, and this applies not only locally, but also globally. But at the same time, while these forces are happening, the centrifugal, as we say, the opposite is happening at the same time. That especially in this digital economy and the knowledge economy, and with the emphasis on creative output and the emphasis on intellectual output, and now even more so in an incredible pace, incredible scale on AI, you have, and with intellectual property being locked in the large companies and these monopolies over data and over knowledge, you have these huge conglomerates getting bigger and bigger, these vertical hierarchies just being more perpetuated, and you have forces going in the opposite direction, which is the centripetal forces. So you can think of the two forces happening at the same time. I would argue that with AI, the forces are actually taking more towards the market concentration, the large ownership of data and ownership of the technology, and of course with closed intellectual property, it becomes even more challenging and more threatening to the global democratization of knowledge and technology. So actually, access to knowledge movement, which I am part of, works precisely towards expanding the forces that encourage open knowledge, open data, open entrepreneurship, open innovation. Actually, we are the North African hub of the Open African Innovation Research Network, where we work with the University of Ottawa and other partners in Africa for research on open innovation. So my answer to you, I guess, in the end, is that in reality, sadly, because of the nature of the technologies and the intellectual property that's associated with it, it is more and more coming to a world where there is a problem. There are bigger inequalities, exacerbated inequalities, sadly. But the only piece of good news to end on an optimistic note is that you can actually, if rational policymakers and with the work of academics, civil society, and others, we can actually work towards using these technologies for initiating initiatives that are for inclusion rather than exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you all for those great presentations, thought-provoking. I have to say, I'm very puzzled now. Yeah, I'm like, this was all very interesting, very important, and yet I cannot understand how we can bring that all together. It seems to me like we need this high-level critical reflection on how we produce AI norms and ethical principles from a broader perspective. We need to bring all those concerns and preoccupations. And then from the bottom, we need to think of what effects they have on the ground and the real consequences that people are experiencing. Nagla, you said it well. We can't talk about the future of work. We need to talk about what's going on now. So at the same time, we do need norms. We do need to regulate what's going on, even though it's a thing that's bigger than us, that's ideological power. So I'll ask two very broad questions. The first one is, and you can feel free to, maybe we'll start with one and then we'll take on with the other one. I'll leave you all the chance to answer. So the first one is, knowing all that, seeing all that, is there anything good or interesting about our current AI norms and ethical charters and principles? Does it give anything? Is there any good impact? Is there anything that we can still take from that? So that will be my first question, backtracking a bit and leaving our, knowing all those critical perspectives. What's good? What can we still keep? What's happening? And then the next question, the next round is, where do we go from there? How do we reconcile all those perspectives? And how can we go forwards and explore new pathways to be able to think of new creative ways, maybe of putting a frame to AI, taking into consideration all that you've brought to the table. So let's start with, let's try to see first, what can we keep from what we have now, what we've been producing. It's not all to put to the garbage. So what is good about that? And can someone start with that question, please? I see David nodding. I mean, you've been involved in making, some ethical principles. So would you like to start?
First.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I think that my sort of approach to the question would be that we need to sort of look through bifocal lenses. It's important on the one side to engage in critical interrogation and reflexive self-questioning as a way to kind of orient where we are and orient, the limitations of our times and how we need to sort of always de omnibus dubitandum, doubt everything, right? As has been said. So I think there's that end of it. But then on the other side, we need to have a constructive kind of view, right? We need to see that if we are just critical, in a sense, ethical nihilism can be just as elitist, right? Because in the everyday world that we live in, we need norms and normativity. We need ethical values to animate our relationships to one another. And just to say, I'm thinking about the field work and the collaboration that we did in a project on data justice. And what we found actually was that the grassroots civil society organizations that had been dealing with datafication and digitization over the last 15 years, that they actually were dealing in really kind of real world kind of ethical dilemmas. And they helped themselves to a normative vocabulary, a vocabulary of rights, a vocabulary of fundamental rights and freedoms and human rights. And so they needed the leverage of normativity in their everyday practice. And so, and the truth is those civil society organizations were well out ahead of the AI kind of discourse that came up over the last few years. And so I'll just point out that, as I said, there's a critical and a constructive side of things. And the two are the same side, the two sides of the same coin, because you wouldn't have the leverage to be critical unless you had access to normative metrics. And so I think we need to navigate with that kind of a balanced point of view.
Yeah, very interesting. So the higher level is the critical side, and then on the ground, we have the constructive side where we need to work with that. And that speaks a lot to what you were saying, Nagla, and I see that you raised your hand, so I'm sure you want to say something.
Thank you very much. I totally agree with David, actually. That's precisely what I would call for, is that you do need the global norms and standards, and you need also broad interpretations, perhaps. So the two levels, the two axes would speak to each other, and you need, sort of expansive interpretations of specific principles and norms and standards to be able to encompass the differences in different contexts, but all agreeing about, some basic principles, but also the interpretation and the application can actually differ from one context to the next to some extent. But certainly this kind of conversation is very important. So we cannot have sort of at the higher level, the meta level or the framing level, without information and experiences, like you mentioned. Brilliant. I mean, the fieldwork bringing their own norms, and this conversation, it's a two-way conversation. So I totally agree. Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Nagla. Yeah, Luke, go ahead.
I also think it's important to, and I think this goes to your work about different frames of AI, to really not just demystify, but really be very quotidian about talking about AI, right? I mean, this is a set of technologies that, they're advanced pattern matching machines, right? They're one in a long history of technologies that can be and have been not just regulated, but also standardized and adjusted and all these sort of things. It took a very long time. It took 50 years, I think, for the boilers of steamships in the 19th century to be standardized, right? These would blow up all the time. killing many people, right? And so it was a long slog to get standards built into the width of the metal and all this. So I think if we think of these systems as sort of fundamentally in that line of other technologies, it becomes much less daunting to think about them being regulable. But I think that the conversations about ethics have pushed us in that direction, right? That I think they're necessary though not sufficient.
Yeah, and that's a good point, and that was one of my follow-up questions. Wouldn't that discussion that we're having around ethics, even though what we're producing is imperfect, isn't it at least allowing us to push the discussion and the reflection forward? Maybe that we didn't have it before with previous technologies, but being that there allows us to go even further. Bilel, Pieter, would you like to?
I mean, I would like to say there's nothing wrong with the principles of trustworthy AI or fairness or autonomy. So there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's just like we need to see the potential, but also the limits of these initiatives. And one of the best things I've read about AI ethics, and it's a provocation, so all the AI ethics people in the room, don't be angry with me. And it's also, I'm referring to the work of someone else. Luc Munn, he wrote a paper, it's open access, with the title, The Uselessness of AI Ethics. And sorry if I'm derailing the conversation.
I want to read it.
So, but basically his argument is they're meaningless, they're isolated, and they're toothless. But the main principle, or what he explains, the argument in that paper, is also like that ethics are not designed to do what we expect them to do. And I think we really need to have a conversation about ethics, AI ethics versus policy and regulation. And I think that's an important part of it. So I'm not against AI ethics, but we need to put it into the right context.
Yeah. Thanks for that clarification. I think it's important because hearing those critical perspectives could lead us to, and I think, and Luc, in your talk, you showed us that we need that diversity of actions, which is important. Bilel, tu peux répondre en français aussi si tu veux.
Je vais répondre en français. Donc, en effet, quand on regarde ce qui se fait en matière les savoirs sur la régulation de l'IA, c'est assez fascinant, c'est d'une intelligence incroyable. David Leslie qui fait des propositions normatives qui sont assez fascinantes, le travail aussi de Luc, hein. Même les ingénieurs eux-mêmes font des choses assez étonnantes. Quand on rentre dans le détail de chacun des principes, de ces fameux principes d'éthique, chacun d'entre eux, c'est un monde de controverses et d'analyses hyper fines. Et donc en effet, tout ça est assez fascinant, mais moi, ma position est un peu facile, je vous l'accorde, mais ce que moi je constate, c'est qu'au fond, c'est qui est en train d'imposer un imaginaire socio-technique. Et on a beau faire tous ces savoirs très fins, il y a un imaginaire qui est en train de s'imposer. Donc je vais faire le point Goldwyn de l'intelligence artificielle, ChatGPT-3, il est en train de venir tout doucement par la petite porte. Les modèles sont transparents, il est même fait. Essayez de lui faire dire quelque chose de raciste, c'est quasi impossible. Vous pouvez lui faire dire des bêtises. Il est éthique déjà. Et pourtant, on voit bien qu'il y a une société qui va se construire progressivement autour de ça, et on n'a pas de prise sur ça. Donc j'avoue que ma position n'apporte aucune solution, et je le regrette. Donc je suis fasciné par les savoirs de produits, par l'épistémologie qui est en train de s'installer autour de tout ça, et en même temps, j'ai l'impression, comme mes collègues qui bossent sur le climat, à côté de moi, il y a un collègue qui bosse sur le climat, qui parle de schisme de la réalité. D'un côté, on veut tout faire, mais on continue d'avancer. Et c'est ce schisme-là qui me fascine et qui m'inquiète un peu. Et je vois bien que ceux qui imposent leur imaginaire, bon, bah, c'est facile, tout le monde le sait, qui est en train d'imposer son imaginaire socio-technique. Voilà.
Mais en même temps, donc, il ne faut pas abandonner l'idée d'essayer de mettre des balises et de réorienter, mais en avançant en fonction de ce qui se passe et en étant conscient des enjeux qui viennent avec.
Mais je vais être un peu radical. Je vais faire mon français de base, mais si on... Il n'y a qu'une réaction quasi révolutionnaire. Si on... à mon avis, ça va être comme dans le film Dune, où on va à un moment donné interdire certaines machines peut-être. Mais Dune, c'est un djihad qui a amené à ça. Ouais. Mais je crois que malheureusement, l'issue du combat, il va être politique, il va être dans la rue, il va être dans un combat violent. Ça, on va en arriver sans doute à un moment donné à une telle dissymétrie. Et c'est pas le futur qui nous attend, c'est l'avenir. Et l'avenir, c'est quoi? C'est le changement climatique. Et on les voit créer des cloud centers, tout numériser, faire ChatGPT 3, alors que ce qui vient vers nous, c'est quelque chose de très dur et de très sombre. Et donc, on voit bien que tout notre débat sur l'éthique, il y a aussi ce truc politique qui est en train de venir.
Bon, ben, la posture française est pertinente. Donc, on va prendre la question de Karine. Si d'autres personnes ont des questions, présentez-vous. S'il n'y a pas de questions, moi, j'en ai plein mon sac. Donc, allons-y comme ça. Karine, je te donne la parole.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your presentation. Hi, Nagla. You don't see me, but remember we've met in Paris virtually. So thank you for your presentation. I should say that I embrace totally the radicality of your position, both Pieter and Bilel. I think, and also I have one comment and one question. The comment is, we talk a lot about, I'm honestly, the more and more I work on AI, and the more I'm against ethics, because I like to hear about this very fancy principle, and everybody is for the virtue, and we don't want inequality, we want justice, and okay, fine. When you go to the ground, and I was very I like what Nagla said. When you go to the ground, people say, okay, this is fine, and most of the AI ethics that has been developed for the developers and for the industry mainly. So, okay, for the people on the ground, what does it mean? And do we need to use, the human rights framework that's already is used nationally, regionally, internationally? It's not perfect, but at least this is one of the tools that people can use to define their realities. Because also in the ethics, discussion or conversation that we're having, I don't find the people's perspective, the people from the ground, someone who is working in the street of a Moroccan street, for example, and you have a massive surveillance system, what can they do when they say, okay, have been discriminated? Because basically this is what is going on. This is discrimination and legal discrimination. And also about the ethics, you can kill people with great ethics. So it doesn't solve your problem. Anyway, I want to open about open AI. And what do you think, guys, about this open trend that we see? I'm working in close collaboration with the First Nation, Indigenous people here in Canada. And from some of them, first of all, the open AI is maybe a distraction about the real inequality and power imbalance that we are. And a lot of people focus on the openness of the technology, but does not focus on the real issue, which is a power issue. So I want to have you 2 cents on that. Thank you.
Merci, Karine. Who would like to start, Pieter?
Well, I would say there's nothing open about open AI. If we're talking about the company, right? I mean, it started as like a non-for-profit, whatever organization, but, it's now, it gained 10 billion for Microsoft. I think what is important here, moving beyond AI ethics, it can, we can have a conversation about ChatGPT, and there's much more reporting about. So it's based on, internet data that we all have produced, but it's OpenAI and Microsoft that will monetize that. It's dependent on exploited labor in the global south for content moderation. It has a huge, cost in terms of the minerals and the resources and the processing and data centers. There's copyright issues, right? Because again, it's scraping, it's stealing. Let's call it. So that's in contradiction to the open character. So I think in a way, what we see, the hype, that it creates an awareness, and hopefully also we will have debates about this, you know, and I think the role, I mentioned already, the role of the media to discuss this and to, you know, not just talk about the hype and how it will change jobs and so on and so forth, but hopefully that creates more, you know, discussion about these aspects, and there's nothing open about open AI.
I'll second all that, and I'll say, you know, it's notable to the extent that ChatGPT flummoxes people, much like other forms of AI have in the past. I don't know if people have heard of ELIZA, the program developed in 1968-9 by Joseph Weizenbaum that was mimicking a Rogerian psychotherapist that, you know, in theory was also a kind of this interactive program. People could ask it questions, it would ask questions back. It seemed like it was kind of interactive, you know, so there's a certain continuity there. I just wanted to the first part of the question, to underscore and amplify something that Nagla, you said, and I hope you'll say more about it, which is that ordinary people, we're all ordinary people, gig workers, Uber drivers, are experts in AI, right? They have a form of expertise that is embodied, that is lived, right? But they understand the impacts of these systems in a way that needs to be not just heard in policy conversations, but also needs to be, in fact, should be at the center of policy conversations, right? So I think we have to really understand the role of that kind of expertise, right? That kind of lived expertise, as well as technical expertise or, you know, critical expertise. So that's what I would say to that.
Nagla, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Look, for the comment, and thanks, Karine. Hi, Karine. Great to see you, finally in person after working together. I wanted to make a comment really about, I'm going to pick that thread and also what Karine said about the man on the streets in Morocco. I think it's very important when we talk about AI ethics that to make a difference for this man in Morocco or for the Uber driver, there has to be a link to the regulation, not only AI regulation. I mean, regulation is, this man's life. Let's take this man or that woman, who's doing selling digitally online. Their lives are affected by more than what is in AI or their ethics. Their lives are affected by competition law, by labor law, by data invisibility. They're not even in the data landscape, and hence they're not part of the safety net. So I guess going back to the point of what to do next, perhaps, getting the legislation, the harmonization of regulation in a way that reflect the AI ethics. And I recall that's very interesting what I think it was David who said it's toothless. You're absolutely right. I mean, how can you impose the enforcement of these ethics in a way that gets reflected in regulation? It's not an easy task, but in a way that's actually relevant and effective. Other than that, it will only be silos and individual initiatives. Not only there is a disconnect between what's happening on the ground and what's happening on the global framing, but also even vertically, there are silos, the different regulations, the different aspects. As I say, I always say real life is interdisciplinary. So we cannot solve solutions in silos. And just like digital divides should be addressed by more than just ICT policies and more than just technological determinism, investing in connectivity and technology and just putting all those plugs. There's a lot more to address digital issues and technical issues. AI is no exception. Through handling sort of what is the analog or the non-technology aspects. I hope this sort of explains a bit where I come from. So thank you.
Thank you very much. David, did you want to answer? Bilel, before I take another question?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say one thing, if I might, and that's just really about I think it's this question of I want to say of being against ethics. So my instinct is that what we should say instead of that we're against ethics is that we should say we're against the misappropriation of ethics, which is to say, in our everyday worlds, we have norms and ethics as in the same way we breathe the air and drink water. I mean, we move around in the world constrained amidst each other, with regard to the rightness of our actions, and it's been part of civilization since the beginning that we have this component. And what we have to be aware of, I think, and this really comes out with OpenAI, by the way, is that can be that like anything else can be used as a weapon, right? So OpenAI, for instance, I talked about this last night. It has on the website that's linked to the release of ChatGPT, has their charter in which they talk about their primary fiduciary duty being to humanity, and all of this other very kind of virtue signally, ethics washing type of language. And so for me, the problem with that isn't that we generally should have a primary fiduciary duty to take care of each other. That's not, I think that's something that I feel in my bones, in a sense. The problem with what's going with OpenAI is exactly that they're using the rhetoric of ethics in a way that isn't consistent with our expectations. And we become critical of that because we do have ethically informed expectations. And so I think we just need to be aware that there is a if you will, a moral grammar underlying the way we criticize OpenAI. And finally, there's a moral grammar underlying even when we talk, well, we need human rights. Yes, of course we need human rights, but what's the moral grammar of human rights itself? And we can see, if we think about autonomy and solidarity and various other ethical principles, these might underlie, some of the basic fundamental rights and freedoms, freedom of expression, physical, mental, moral integrity. I mean, there are rights and freedoms that are so anchored in ethical normative concepts that we can't, we shouldn't disentangle them. We should always be aware that, these are just things that we need to live with, in a sense, in order to potentially, have standards of rightness in the way we treat each other.
Thank you very much, David, for that nuance about the being against the misappropriation of ethics, and Nagla said that she agrees with him. I also agree with you. I think it's very important to make that nuance, because so maybe it would bring us to reflect on how we do ethics, and not being like we won't be against the ethical principles, but maybe we can do ethics in a better and more like concrete way. In applied ethics, we often say that our role is to minimize the gap between our discourses and our ideals and our practices, and maybe that's where we have to work, in closing that gap, instead of just thinking, oh, ethics is no good anymore. So maybe it's time, like 20 years ago, we didn't even want to hear about ethics and technology. Today, we're open to it. So maybe it's time to go to the next level by reflecting on how we do ethics, and maybe we can do it in a way that answers or reflects more the real issues that we see in the world. Bilel, you wanted to add something? So I'll go on to the next question. And one or two last questions. The persons who are already there, I'll take those questions, and then we'll go for lunch.
Thank you. Thank you for all your presentations. My name is Pieter. I'm a former activist turned AI activist, and I'm director of a group called AIGS Canada. My question is regarding democratic engagement. There was talk about pushing back on the political construct of AI. I saw, in personal experience, I saw a very slow lag in reacting to climate change. And I'm seeing almost no reaction to AI. I think part of its complexity, part of its speed, part of its lack of tangibility. What in your minds would you think it would take to go from where we are now, which is almost no engagement, especially on things like C27, to an active, democratic, engaged public? Like, what's missing for people to actually react? Yeah. Je peux répéter en français si tu veux. Ou... la question, c'est par rapport à l'engagement démocratique. Qu'est-ce que ça prendra pour que le monde général, le public général, s'engagera sur justement sur l'IA comme problématique politique.
Tu veux dire, qu'est-ce que ça changera? Qu'est-ce que ça changerait qu'il y ait une démocratisation plus grande
Oui, voilà, qu'est-ce qui manque en fait pour que les gens soient dans la rue en disant oui, contre l'IA ou pour l'IA ou...
Yeah, and maybe it speaks to what Pieter was saying, that we don't have an anti-AI movement like we had an anti-GMO movement like 20 years ago, for example. So what do we need to have people like do something about it?
I mean, as I said earlier, it's like shifting the conversation and the discourse, you know, and opening up, and that's the AI hype is all about, you know, the new innovation and what it will bring to us, but it's not questioning do we need that, and you know, let alone discussing the negative outcomes of the technology. So more awareness of this, more discussion, but also more inclusion, you know, and Nagla's talk about the context and the people on the ground was also like a lot of AI ethics initiatives, you know, the people who are most impacted, and that's in the global south, but also, you know, in the south parts in the global north, you know, AI is used to punish the poor, you know, to, I don't know, gendered bias and so on and so forth. So more awareness of this, and I think, you know, we need to mobilize, but on a collective level, you know, and, you know, this comparison between nuclear power and AI, we know it's very, you know, it has huge potential, but also we understand the risks of nuclear power, and there are huge risks with AI as well. So why don't we have the movement?
Maybe we haven't seen those risks enough anymore yet.
I think one thing to say initially, right, is that AI systems are extremely good at suppressing protest and controlling civil society, right? So you're you know, trying to fight back against something which is already being used and already is being used through facial recognition, through, you know, its involvement in the carceral state, through precisely through kind of automated management of welfare, of various things, right? To kind of tamp down on social unrest preemptively. I also think we have a more general problem of democratic engagement, right? I mean, it's you know, we see people manifesting or protesting against some things, but it's, you know, again, our current media environment is rather designed to push back against that. But I think that when people understand the visceral impact of these technologies on their everyday lives and practices, right, and that helps. And so, again, being very banal about these technologies, right? That they are not Commander Data or HAL 9000 or some sort of science fiction story. That they are, you know, in, as David pointed out, much longer histories of quantification and calculation, and that they are now being used to do things like, you know, make you work harder or deny you benefits or survey you, right? Those are the things that will resonate with people.
Je vais continuer en français. Je crois que pour comprendre la difficulté de pourquoi on n'a pas des mouvements aussi forts que les OGM ou le nucléaire, c'est vrai qu'on peut se dire comment ça se fait que personne peut oser demander des comptes à ces chercheurs qui font un transformer qui est dans chat. Pourquoi ils sont aussi libres? Et pourquoi on n'arrive pas à aller dans la rue? Mais au fond, pourquoi? Parce que c'est nous qui avons fait l'IA. ChatGPT-3, c'est déjà nous. C'est nous qui l'entraînons un petit peu. C'est nous qui avons fait... Nous sommes c'est la force du numérique, c'est que les usagers sont ceux qui créent... l'innovation vient à la fois par le haut, mais nous aussi, nous y participons. C'est-à-dire que si nous étions, à mon avis, tous en train de mettre une brique sur une centrale nucléaire, je pense qu'on aurait aussi un peu de mal. Donc, en fait, c'est pour ça que je crois qu'il est très difficile d'en faire un mouvement social classique. Parce que nous sommes les usagers et que nous avons... Le numérique, nous l'avons tous un peu fait. Quand Google est devenu très riche, un peu sur notre dos. On le sait tous, c'est nous qui avons créé ces hyperliens qui permettaient à l'algorithme d'apprendre. Vous voyez, ces machines géantes qui sont devenues très intelligentes, elles sont intelligentes via l'intelligence collective qu'elles arrivent à extraire de la valeur de l'intelligence collective. Et donc c'est pour ça que c'est très dur, à mon avis, d'en faire un mouvement. Mais peut-être qu'un jour, ça sera possible, ça sera envisageable. Mais c'est vrai que Et en plus, il y a ce confusionnisme à la OpenAI, ce que j'appelle le confusionnisme, c'est-à-dire que nous sommes trompés en permanence. Et c'est très important. Enfin, si on veut lutter contre l'extrême droite, peut-être que certains n'ont pas envie de lutter contre l'extrême droite, mais il faut comprendre le confusionnisme qu'elle a produit. Elle parle au nom de la gauche aussi, l'extrême droite aujourd'hui. L'extrême droite italienne, l'extrême droite française, c'est un peu différent peut-être en Amérique du Nord. C'est pareil. Bon. Et donc, vous voyez, donc il faut si on veut être dans la rue, il faut qu'on commence à comprendre le confusionnisme qu'ils ont fabriqué. Mais ce sera très dur.
Nagla, I think you have to leave, so you want to say bye?
I also want to be faithful to your question. I'm going to say a couple of words just on the step forward. I think this gathering in and of itself is a great step. So more of this type of conversation, bringing in people from the international norm setting, camp, if you will, along with perhaps people who are working on the ground, or more of the stakeholders that we spoke about earlier from different parts of the world would be great. I am sorry I have to leave. I have a commitment, but thank you also very much. It's a great opportunity, and I really enjoyed and learned from everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nagla, for being here. And so we're going to do this again, and next time we hope you're going to be here with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Then I have Arinka, and one last question after.
You were there before. It's okay? Quick question. What part do you perceive or think AI literacy can play in democratizing AI, and also kind of in empowering the ordinary people, so to speak? Est-ce que vous avez compris ma question? Oui. Oh, oui. Excellent.
Okay, can I add on to that? So,
perfect.
My question was twofold. So what I wanted to say was, earlier somebody spoke about, where's the space of ethno-racial communities here? And, we're talking about Black Lives Matter, where somebody had that in their slides, if I remember well. But what are we doing to actually hold space in order to transfer knowledge to these communities? And this is where I link up to what you're saying, an add-on as on, okay, what is being done? Because a lot of people here have participated in ethics frameworks, so maybe you'll have an answer for us. And would that help actually in getting people to the street, just like you said, Bilel, in saying, just, 20 years ago, a lot of people were told, your food is a bit toxic now. So you gotta get up and go to the street. So, how about people hold workshops with movements like Black Lives Matter or others, and clarifying what AI is doing to them in their daily lives, and actually holding space for their voices. Because if we look around in this room, the voices of diversity is not really well represented, and that's normal. That's because this is AI. So that was my thing. And then there's a very technical question for you, Luke Stark, about the inference, because I wanted to learn more about this, and how can we catch when people use inference, if there's a tray for that and a mechanism for that. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's start with the literacy, the question about literacy. Can it help empower people, citizens, and let them, help them to do something about that?
I'll very quickly answer the second question, which is that I can't answer that right now to you, but maybe offline. I think literacy helps, and I think literacy across the spectrum of organizations is important. And I especially think, and thank you for this excellent point about diversity and holding space, I think that in particular, the work of social movements like Data for Black Lives or others, and I'm thinking of especially of Our Data Bodies, which is a wonderful collective in, I believe, Detroit. They've really taken the lead in extending workshops, practical tools. I think our data bodies, I think it's called the Digital Defense Toolbook or Playbook. If you Google our data bodies, you'll find it. So I think that's really critical. I think there's more that we in academia can do to support that work, to reinforce that work, as well as reinforcing the questions of diversity in the academy. And I think literacy helps, but I think that, and this sort of goes back to the question about democratic movements. You need an inside play and an outside play. You need the people inside the system who understand what's going on, and you also need the activists who are pushing them.
Thank you, Luke. Pieter, Bilel, David, who would like to go, and then it's going to be the wrapping up of the round table at the same time. David, would you be ready?
Yes, actually, I'd like to answer sort of both of the questions side by side because I think they're very related. So I think we need to make, and hold space through the democratic governance of the technologies. And that starts through meaningful participation, meaningful and informed participation. The importance of having engagements that involve people in the co-production and co-design, not only of the technologies, but also of the policies and regulations that will come to govern the technologies is hugely important. And we won't be able to get there to that point of inclusive, informed, and meaningful participation until we have a better and more equitable access to what we could call data, digital, or AI literacy, but even more so, and I think this speaks to some of the wider challenges that we've surfaced in the conversation. If we don't have a more equitable society where people can, in their everyday lives, fully participate, be included in the economy, be included in the educational systems, we will just be sort of contributing to the sort of ethics washing and virtue signaling. We need to address the root causes of the lack of representation in the room. And that's not a technology problem, that's a social problem. And it's something that I think if talking about AI gives us an occasion to turn back and try to sort of revolutionize parts of society that are broken, then it's a good thing. Because that at the end of the day, that is where the social change, the needed transformation will take place, not in the design laboratory or in the computer science lab.
Yeah, ethics of AI as an occasion to talk about that. Thank you very much, David. Pieter, Bilel, what would you like to answer to finish our roundtable?
I mean, to the last two questions, I think I agree. We need more mundane, everyday, how we use AI, how it's impacting our lives, rather than the high-level, AI hypes. So I think more like a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down. And I think that's also one of the problems of AI ethics. Basically, it's mostly, top-down. I think there is some momentum in participatory machine learning, participatory AI. But there's also then the risks, what will this participation lead to? Adeba Berihane has written very powerfully about this. And she also argues beyond talking to people in the global south and, acknowledging the need for diversity, it's also acknowledging the systematic exploitation and inequalities that are inherently in technology. And I mean, David talked already about this early in the presentation. So I think that's central, first of all, starting with that acknowledgement, and then much more like a bottom-up approach and listening to communities rather than only focusing and following a top-down approach.
Mm-hmm. communities who are experiencing the consequences of AI, not only the ones who are developing AI, right?
Yes, exactly, because it's most often the people who will suffer the most or will be most impacted. They're marginalized communities who and that's also a challenge for us in academia and how we can reach out to these communities because they often have more, another priority. They don't have the time the resources to engage in, answering the questions that we ask them and so on and so forth.
And if they have no voice, as David said, if we're in a society that doesn't give them much power and much more voice, then how can they organize to get that? So who should be organizing it? Because we don't want it to be organized from top down again, Luke. Yeah, and then Bilel goes,
ChatGPT is a good example of this, right? The developers of these systems are coming for your jobs, right? They want to make your jobs worse. All of you, right? Students, academics, we've been talking a lot about plagiarism and academic integrity in the context of ChatGPT. Right. It's not that there won't be no jobs, but these jobs will be controlled and structured by a very small number of developers who work for big, rapacious corporations. Right. So there is self-interest here for all of you. We're not just talking about marginalized communities. Of course, they are at the front lines of these effects. But if it's not stopped there, it will come for you and for me.
Bilel, le mot de la fin?
Bon, je te le laisserai volontiers, alors sur cette histoire de littératie, moi je vais vous donner un exemple. Alors, imagine, avec mes étudiants, on a essayé avec Stable Diffusion, tout ça, de comprendre, d'ouvrir la boîte noire. Et ce que j'ai compris, c'est qu'on a tout ce qu'il fallait pour ouvrir la boîte noire. Mais je me suis senti un petit peu comme si on donnait à un individu les clés d'une centrale nucléaire face à Stable Diffusion, on le mettait en slip, même sans la combinaison de protection, et on lui disait, vas-y. On avait un jeu de données de plusieurs milliards d'images. On a calculé, il nous fallait au moins 40 000 € de temps de calcul si on voulait un tout petit peu essayer d'évaluer ce qu'il y avait derrière le jeu de données. Il fallait plusieurs mois pour que ça tourne. Donc on a fabriqué un truc, un monstre informatique, sur lequel on est un petit peu comme si on mettait un ingénieur de bon niveau devant les centrales nucléaires tout seul, juste avec la clé. Et même, on lui donne tout le cahier des charges, on lui dit où sont les capteurs.
Il y a accès à toute l'information.
On est comme ça face à Stable Diffusion.
On est
comme
transparent.
Ça. Voilà, mais on est un peu comme ça, tout nu. Il nous faudrait, donc pour ça, qu'est-ce qu'il faudrait? À mon avis, il faudrait des calculateurs publics. Alors, qui vont encore coûter beaucoup d'énergie pour les évaluer, pour qu'on puisse évaluer ça. Donc, ce n'est pas que de la littératie qu'il nous faut, c'est une sorte de symétrie des pouvoirs, et là, on en est vraiment loin. Donc, auditer des algorithmes, là, actuellement, c'est en fait impossible. C'est impossible, sauf à avoir vraiment des moyens économiques, et je ne crois pas que la Commission européenne va donner autant de moyens. Ils ont créé un board, il est prévu dans la loi un board pour évaluer les machines, et je ne crois pas que Veritas, qui est un truc de certification de machines, il va dépenser 40 000 $ pour évaluer un truc. Donc voilà, je voudrais qu'on sente ce truc-là. On a fabriqué des centrales nucléaires, le plutonium, c'est un peu ça pour moi aussi.
Merci, Bilel. So I think that on those very interesting thoughts, we're gonna go eat and feed our bodies because we fed our brains a lot, and lots of what we've said in this discussion leads to this afternoon's discussion with Karine about what do we do and how can we have more participative ways of doing things around AI to make sure that it's more inclusive and people who use it can participate in those frameworks and the reflection around it. So thank you very much.